Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Holger Putin, founder of London Institute of Photography. And it's an honor to have you here at TED tonight. And I think we can start with this talk now. Fantastic.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. And this is a very much an honor and a weird time where we can be doing a talk in London from Texas and broadcast it all around the world. So it's kind of cool, actually. It's very weird for me, and I'm really flattered to be able to do my first talk without pants. So this will be fun to go through. I'm teasing, of course. But anyway, this is an honor to do. And we were talking about some preliminary ideas about what we would discuss today. And in thinking about it, there's a lot that I share on my YouTube channel that many of you guys probably know, and some things that I don't talk about just because they're more personal and they're not secret. And so we thought it might be kind of fun to pull back the curtain and dive in a little harder on some of those things. I have a background in music, and Holger and I were talking about that before, and how that relates to photography and how that has been kind of a weird theme that comes back in my life over and over again, whether it's the artist series or whether it's discussions like this. And so, but anyway, I have this separated kind of into 5 sections. And what I was thinking is, what would, since this is for a school, what would a much older Ted or future Ted tell past Ted? And what would my advice be? And so there's 5 essential points that I want to make in this conversation for you guys that I want you to get out of this. One, I want to talk about just, as an artist, as a photographer, you're always a culmination of all of your life's experiences, good or bad. I want to talk about having a philosophy. This is something that's very important to me, and it's what's going to essentially separate you from one who just takes a bunch of pictures. It's very important. Also, I think it's important to find a way to meet your heroes, and I'm going to talk a lot about artist series. I think that's a big part of that. And then, I think understanding your place in time is crucial, especially today. We live in a world that in the last 20 years has been rapidly changing, or changing at a more rapid pace than it ever has before, largely driven by technology. And if you were to tell me in high school what I would be doing for a living today, I wouldn't understand it. I mean, this job did not exist. YouTube didn't exist. The internet was referred to as the information superhighway in all the TV commercials. And I would go to a computer class in high school with a green and black screen with dots, and we would learn how to code BASIC. And I thought, well, this is kind of fun, but where would I ever use this? And so we'd try to create loops to crash the computer. We were punks back then. But anyway, so that's what I want to get into today. And I want to start at the top. I have some slides that hopefully I will be able to go back and forth with smoothly here. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go there. And then I have slides right here. So first, I want to talk about this. You are a combination of your life's experiences, and these define you. And I think this is something that most people are aware of, but I want to get into more what I mean by this, because my life has had a lot of different paths that I've taken. When I was in the 8th grade, I started playing guitar, and that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I got really serious, really into it. And I didn't end up becoming a musician by trade. I ended up becoming a YouTuber by trade, which is odd, but I talk about photography, and it's a career that I'm very comfortable with, and it allows me an enormous amount of flexibility. And I don't have to do things that I didn't like when I was freelancing or working with clients, that kind of thing. So sometimes we know those experiences are really good, and sometimes we know they're really bad and they're going to impact us, right? And they can be little things. And then I think what's more interesting are the things that are much broader that you don't see in the moment. And for me, a lot of that was music school. I saw it as something very different at that time. And knowing now, and when I realized I wasn't going to be a musician, it really was painful for me to go through that. I'm really glad I did today. And we were talking before we started the live conversation here. And that's something that if I could go back and do it differently, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably do the exact same thing. I think I've learned to be proud of that and make it part of who I am. But going back to the very beginning, some of you probably have heard this. I've talked about this before, but I want to talk about my very first experience with photographs and what that meant. So when I was probably about 10 years old, My father was an illustrator, still is. It moved to Dallas because there was a large advertising industry going on here for the Southwest. And there were a lot of other creative people in the community back then. And one of his best friends was this gentleman by the name of Greg Booth. And Greg was an unbelievable human being. He was kind of a class clown, kind of a character, brilliant photographer. He was, when I say brilliant, he was by far the most successful person in the industry down here. He had, they had a lot of annual reports, which was the industry back then. You would shoot for these, this is before the web, so companies would publish these books and they would call it an annual report. It would have all the financial numbers, and it was in their best interest to make these look good. And they would spend a lot of money on these. Stock photography back then wasn't what it is today. And Greg spent probably 250 days out of the year on the road shooting location work for catalogs, or annual reports, we call them. And it could be oil rigs, it could be something in the city, it could be people shots, it could be whatever they were discussing in the annual report. Anyway, he was very successful doing that. He also owned a photo studio, and they employed, at one point it was up to 8 photographers, I believe, that all they did was product work for catalogs. And he was extremely successful. But he had an interesting background too. He was Arnold Newman's assistant, and before he went on his own. And I, at the age of 10, had no idea who this Newman guy they talked about all the time was. But I remember going over to their house. We would go over there for dinner. Our families were very close, and there was no one my age. They had a daughter my sister's age, and so I was kind of on my own. So I'd wander around the house, and they had the most beautiful black and white photographs everywhere. And there was one that particularly, I got to share the screen again, caught my attention, that I remember very vividly, to the point where I would just stare at this thing. And it was, of course, whoops, went ahead. It was the famous Arnold Newman portrait of Igor Stravinsky. And at the time, I had no idea who Igor Stravinsky was. I'm 10 years old, right? All I knew is this was a guy sitting at the piano, and he had to be a musician, right? And so it spoke to me as an environmental portrait. But what struck me about this photo in particular was mainly the piano lid. And sometimes this is called the B-flat picture, because it looks like a lowercase b, or the flat symbol if you're talking about musical notation. What's really cool about this image, though, is when you get into it, and like this particular scan of this, the print is off. If you look at the lower right-hand corner where it fades out, it doesn't matter. It's still such a brilliant composition that, like, pixel peeping on this level is absurd. The composition is so well defined in the crop. It only, and I even remember this at the age of 10, is that what I liked about it is that there was only the information that you needed in the photo. We don't need to see his legs. We don't need to see the floor. We don't even need to see the keys of the piano. I can tell what it is by the lid. How cool is that, right? The other cool thing that defines this, if you look at it in terms of rule of thirds, is the way the wall works in the background, where you have that dividing line and a darker shade and a lighter shade in the back. That is disrupted by that B flat. So this is kind of a somewhat modernist technique that was popular in the mid-century, in terms of dynamic symmetry in a way, but I think more of what it is its contrast in the diagonal lines versus the straight up and down. The other thing that I love about it, and I later on studied graphic design in college, and I took a course, and this woman that was the teacher was great, and Lori went into all this stuff with composition. One of my favorite things that she taught me is that, you know, if you want to bring emphasis on something, put it near a corner or an edge. Things at the corners and the edges tend to have more weight, for good, for better or worse. I mean, you see some photographs where things are left in the corners and it works against the photograph. But in this case, it was intentional, and it's amazing. Now, what's interesting about this is the crop. If you guys have ever seen the actual negative of this, it is a much bigger composition that takes place. You actually see the molding on the floor, for instance. You see the legs of the piano, you see his other hand, you know. And so this was cropped in post, and Newman did a lot of that. The other cool thing, and I didn't find any of this till years and years later when I actually became very obsessed with photography, but there are outtakes to this too. Now, Greg would go on shoots. He wasn't on this one. He was on, I believe it was the Gerald Ford portrait shoot. And he said that Newman was very interesting, that there was obviously an element of putting on a show with Arnold Newman. He would show up, have a cigar, and immediately immerse himself with the subject that was being shot, move the camera around a couple times, and he expected everything to work, and the assistant's job was that. But he said it was really casual. But when you look at these different pictures, they're all very different. For instance, the most obvious comparison is that Stravinsky moves in every image he's reposed. But also look at the angle of where the camera is. Like you can see from the top left shot how between that and the rest, he moved the camera down in a way. So there's an enormous amount of experimentation, and you can learn a lot from these. And my takeaway is that Arnold Newman knew what he was going for. It was just a matter of giving himself a couple different options to go from. None of them are radically different, but it is interesting to see how they worked. This next photo, this is Greg, who was my mentor, my dad's friend who assisted Newman. And this was actually taken by Newman. When Newman got sick right before he died, he was at Mount Sinai Hospital, and Greg went up to visit him regularly. And Newman actually took this from his hospital bed. And Greg used to pride himself on saying this was Newman's last portrait, and whether it was or not, I don't know, but possibly. But Greg was, he was a superhero and had an enormous impact on my life and where I've ended up and you know, my trajectory. So that was where photography was for me. And after seeing the Newman picture, I really wanted a camera. I begged my parents for it. And my first camera was a little Kodak 110. And if you remember the 110, it was the cartridge film that you'd buy at the drugstore. I always had the little thin layer of dust at the top because they'd sit out for a long time. But that led my life down the road to discovering this. And Holger's smiling, so I think he knows what this is. So this is what we referred to in the 70s and 80s as the photomat or the photo hut. They had one of these in That 70s Show on American television a couple years ago. And what this was a way to get your film developed in the late 70s and early 80s. I would mow yards, I would save all my money, and I would take pictures just of everything. And there was something so amazing about having my mom roll up to this thing, and you'd go in one side to drop off your film, and it would take them 2 weeks, and you'd have to specify if you wanted prints, doubles, whatever. They usually have a deal where you get the free double print. And then a week later, you'd get a phone call and your prints would be ready, and you'd drive to the other side of this photo hut and you would pick it up. And as ridiculously silly as that is, it was something that was, I mean, that was my existence back then. It was, but photography, you know, I was really young at this point. I mean, this would have been the age of maybe 11, because I think for my birthday, I got that camera, and I would take pictures of my friends doing stupid things. And it was not a serious venture. It was being a kid, but what I remember about that, and I think is the important takeaway, is that photography, especially today with phones, is that there's so many different purposes for photography and people's experience with that. And so, you know, we're all talking about this from an art perspective, but there are utilitarian purposes to this as well. Texting somebody a picture of, or how many times do you photograph something that, like the other day we ran out of Tylenol, and so I was trying to remember which one to get. So I take a picture of it so when I get to the store, I can see it. So there's all these purposes of it. And for me, my life at that time, that's what it was. It was just capturing memories of my friends and things like that. And they're in a box somewhere, and I don't revisit those much, but it stuck with me and it never left. And what happened was, by the time I got in the 8th grade, I became obsessed with music. That was where my life was headed and where I wanted to be. And I played guitar, and I was fortunate enough to, we have what we called at the time, it's called something else now, but it was a magnet school. And so it was part of the public school system, but you had to audition to go. There was a health magnet for people who were interested in health sciences early on. There was a law magnet, and they also had an arts magnet. That's what it was called. And so I auditioned and went to arts magnet, and it was an amazing school. It was kind of like Fame, but we didn't dance on the lunch tables. Erica Badu was a friend of a friend. She went to school there. It was a really cool time, and it was an amazing experience. And you know, you still had to do all your core curricular classes like government and health and English and all that. And so after my first year, I would enroll in summer school and pack the schedule so I could get all those classes out of the way so I could come take more music classes. Because it was kind of like they had classes if you had room in your schedule to take them. So I thought, my God, I'm going to make room and make sure that happens. And so that was where that led. And eventually I went to college, to the University of North Texas. And when I started there, I started in jazz guitar and got very interested in classical guitar at one point. I was just into new things, and I had a huge passion for discovery, I think, at that point in my life. And eventually this all changed. It was interesting because I didn't think about it, Holger, until you were talking about it a minute ago, but like essentially we had a class. It was the easiest class you could take in the jazz department. It was called Jazz Lecture Series. And it was like, all they did was take attendance. There was never anything to turn in. So you either got the A or you didn't, you know. It was only 1 hour of credit, but it was such a fun class. And they would have, I think it was every other week, they would have a guest lecture. And so it's much like what you guys are doing with this. And I just fell in love with that thing. It was amazing to see the width of musicians they had come in. It was just varying styles. It was very diverse. And there was one that absolutely changed my life forever moving forward. And we had this guy come in. His name was Bob Belden. And Bob Belden is a tenor sax player. I think he had gone to the school back in the day. And when I saw him, when he came in to do the lecture, he was one of the VPs at Columbia Records. And in those days, you know, we were still buying CDs. That was the way we listened to music. And he oversaw all the box set productions. So if you guys remember this, it was like, you know, he had his area of specialties was Miles Davis. So they would reissue these Miles Davis records. So like Bitches Brew or Kinda Blue or whatever it was, they'd collect all the outtakes, they'd put it together with new artwork, new packaging. It was this amazing production. Well, he produced those. And so that was his claim to fame. And I was interested in him from that perspective because I was a huge Miles Davis fan at that point. And like, I could not get enough Miles Davis ever. John Coltrane, whatever. And I didn't care what style of music it was. Anything Miles Davis was the best. So here comes a guy that knows all about him. And so he's talking and he's doing his thing. And towards the end, he said, you know, you guys are in school right now and you need to stop for a minute and look at what's around you and realize the significance of that. And he said, you have the ability right now and the opportunity to learn how to write for big band. You have the ability to learn how to write for orchestra, for chamber ensemble, for solo instruments, and you can get them played. And this is very difficult to do when you get out of school. He said, you know, and in his case, being a musician, moves to New York, you have to hire musicians to come play your stuff. It's very expensive. So it's a very different situation. And so I remember leaving the room and hearing that thinking, my God, the guy's right. And it piqued my curiosity. In the very next semester, I signed up for jazz arranging. I was no longer a jazz major at that point and drove my parents up the wall because why are you taking all these classes that aren't even part of your major? Because they're there, right? You know, you have to do them. And I was so happy I did that. And I had opportunity in jazz arranging. I didn't ever do an original piece for that, but I would arrange Beatles songs for big band, which was very fun. And then my culmination was before I graduated, I did this big orchestration project, and I wrote a series of 5 short miniatures. I called them for symphony orchestra, and we got them played. And it was a nerve-wracking experience because the way they would do this, it was after finals. So you're already into the summer. No one in that orchestra wants to be sitting there, particularly playing student work. Those days, it was early software, so we were required to copy parts by hand. And literally, I remember Starbucks had stores for the first time back then, and I would just go buy bags of coffee and stay up all night and copy parts with the ruler and the pencil. And you haven't lived until you've done that. But anyway, so I was fortunate in that I had the conductor's assistant was assigned to me. You had to be assigned somebody who was a conducting major who would help you through the process of getting it played. And so he had a little bit of clout with some of these students, and it was ugly, man. We were sitting in there, and some of my colleagues, like my roommate, wrote a piece in 7 flats for strings, which I don't know why, but he did. That it won't be in tune. Let's just say you have to understand the instruments you're writing for. And I mean, I thought he was going to like lose it when he left. He was so mad because he put a lot of work into it, but made a very fundamental error. So I'm like starting to sweat. I mean, you know, I'm going to get this piece played by the orchestra. And I got up and there's nothing you can do. You're just sitting there. The conductor takes over. And I'm like, I just want to like disappear into the ground. I mean, it was just so nerve wracking and embarrassing. Like, here's your work. You've never really heard it outside of you banging out chords on a piano and stuff. And they started up. And like, it's just chills went up my spine, and to hear my own music being played like that. And they did make one big mistake, and he took them back, and I recorded it. And I have to find this because it's going to rot off the tape one day if I don't transfer it to digital, but you can put an edit point because they went back. But I got a good reading, and afterwards they stop, and nobody claps at these things, right? It's not, it's not a concert. And Dr. Brusilov, Ansel Brusilov, who was a famous conductor in New York, who was then retired sort of, and he was working at the college. He was the head of the symphony stuff. And so he comes up to the podium and he goes, slams it down. He says, whose work is this? And I'm like, mine. And he says, not bad, and walked away. That was the guy. I was just like, and everybody was mad because I had a good reading. But anyway, it was great. And that was a huge experience. And I'm so glad I did that, because like, since, you know, when I graduated college, I had aspirations of going into film scoring. I was trying to think of a practical way I could make a living writing classical music. And there really wasn't one. I was doing gigs in Dallas. I played in a jazz band. I played a lot of country music, and about drove me insane. And I realized that I could move to Los Angeles, and the way the industry works is there's only 2 or 3 people who are doing big movies. It's Hans Zimmer and John Williams and maybe one other, you know, and they hire people to work for them to ghostwrite. But I was tired of starving at that point. It took me way too long to get through college. And so I didn't know what to do. So without making this too long, I went to go work for a music software company. This was during the tech boom, late 90s. And that was a huge change for me, because I was hired to go in and transcribe, like we would do how to play kind of titles, and they were on CD-ROM. This is going to date it. But you would get this, you put it in your computer, and it would show you how to play songs by Jimi Hendrix. So they hired me to listen to the record and transcribe it, and write down all the music, and then follow the bouncing ball, and I had to learn how to play it. And so it was a lot of work, and it was really fun. But it also got me into video and onto that end of it. And all of a sudden, photography kind of started coming back to me. I just had this artistic edge. I was around other creative people, but it was in the realm of technology. And that was a huge deal for me. And I think it got me really excited about new things again. And I worked for the next couple of years. They went in and out of business a few times until the crash of 2001, which wiped everybody out. And at that point, I thought, well, I'll go freelance. And I was still kind of swimming around in terms of what I wanted to do. I went back to college, and I did not get a second degree, but I just studied graphic design because I wanted to know about visual composition. These are things that I talk about in my videos today, and that's where I got all that stuff. I needed another discipline for it to make sense. But, you know, I think the takeaway from this is that, you know, you're a culmination of everything, right? It's the culmination of the life experiences. And if you let it influence you in a positive way, and, you know, the only advice I would give on this is, like, don't fight it sometimes. If you got to take a break from photography and do something else, go with it. It might just influence it when it comes back. For instance, it was, like I said, it was really hard for me to leave music at that time. I mean, a lot of it too is when you're in music school, and I don't know if all art schools are like this, but music schools were. If you've ever seen the Drumline movie, where it's like a really intense environment, it was a little over the edge, but I mean, it was pretty tense. And there was always a sense of shame for those who graduated and quote unquote couldn't make it. Even really good musicians. It was kind of like the equivalent of internet trolls today, but they were real life students that were your friends and stuff. Yeah, so couldn't make it, and, you know, and so you never wanted to be the guy who couldn't make it. And I kind of thought that's what I was at one point. I mean, it was a lot to get over. This all changed though. One summer, we're in Texas, and it is really, really, really hot here. And sometimes you get a really nasty summer where you have no rain for over 100 days. The news loves to pick this up, day 88, and, you know, and it doesn't help because you're sweating. And so at that point, I was freelancing, and I could pretty much do my own schedule. And so I started becoming very obsessive about photography again. And I put a dark room in my apartment. And that's what I would do, is I would stay up at night and shoot and develop film. And I wanted to learn the process behind it. I'd never learned any of those things. I wanted to learn how to print. I wanted to learn how to do color film, all those things. And so it was an entire summer of just like in the woodshed, so to speak. And let me go back to my screen share on this, because I can show you the work that I was doing back then. Let's see. So I did not shoot the photo hut, full disclosure. Anyway, this is the kind of stuff I was doing. It was a lot of botanical stuff. Not only was I shooting all the time, but during the day, you'd sit in the air conditioner, and you can imagine I really wasn't getting a lot of work done at this point, but it was important to me. I wasn't interested in freelancing, I guess, as much, and I was interested in photography, but I was interested in the abstract, and a lot of these are color work, working with transparency film, slides. At this point in my life, I had no money, and to do experimental stuff, it invited, you know, any money I had, I would spend on film, chemicals, or cheap cameras on eBay. I really wanted to be shooting on a Hasselblad. I could not afford one, so I had the Soviet knockoff from the 70s, and that's what I did. And a lot of these are macro. You've got to find a way to shoot macro, right? And so what do? You take the lens off and turn it around, and you mess with the color paper on the walls. And I didn't have any lights. This was all, I lived in a loft, so it was big room lighting. And this is what I was experimenting with, were colors, abstractions, and they're not great. They're pictures of flowers. For me, they were a huge triumph because I was learning how to develop a sensitivity to points of focus, what I wanted to draw the eye into, like for instance, on the sunflower, the leaf coming off the bottom. You know, how you could abstract something like the pear that kind of looks like a light bulb, it's slightly out of focus. There's some motion blur, so on and so forth. Experimenting with line, form, shape. All these were shot at night. I did have some lights that I would diffuse and learn how to light a bit. And then it came down to this shot, which again, it's 3 eggs, whatever. But at the time I got this book by John Blakemore, and it was essentially another rehash of the zone system that Ansel Adams had already done. And every one of Ansel's students had done follow-up books, and everybody's trying to re-explain it. And Blakemore was the first guy that it made sense. And when you're shooting in black and white, you have a huge degree of interpretation that you can go for. And this was an experimental shot. It was very intentional. And what you do is if you've never worked with zone system, essentially what it does is it allows you to define where your shadows are going to be with the most amount of detail before they start going too black and too dark. And you determine where your highlights are going to be. And then you adjust your film development time and temperature accordingly. And so what you can do is I think the equivalent to this today would be HDR, where you're compressing a wider dynamic range into a narrow range. But what Blakemore did, and I thought this was so cool, and I was experimenting with myself, is like, okay, what if something goes to pure white or pure black? It becomes high key or low key, and it's okay to abstract it. And so intentionally, what I did is I put the shadows right below the eggs in the foreground. Like if you shot that with your auto exposure, it would put that at what we would call zone 3, which is, you know, zone 1 being the darkest, 3 still got some detail. Well, I don't want zone 3. So I lifted those up to about zone 5 or 6. I can't remember where it was exactly. And what you're going to do is there's no way you're going to rescue the highlights. Well, these eggs are sitting on a piece of paper on my oven at the time, so I didn't want anything in the background. So I just needed what I had in the shot. And so it was a way of piecing all this stuff together, just using the knowledge I had and experimenting with it and just seeing what worked. I did a whole bunch of these white images, and this was the one that I liked in the end because, you know, they're eggs, right? Big deal. But that's what we're doing, is we're playing with the placement. You can't do that in color the same way because sometimes you just get weird noise and blown out highlights or where those transitions occur. But with black and white, that was just an enormous draw to me. Again, working with form, I moved to large format. These calla lilies were shot with large format cameras, 4x5, using Polaroid Type 55 film, which is long gone. But Type 55 was the pack film. It had a negative and a print, and you would run it through the rollers and it would develop it instantly. The print I couldn't care less about, but the negatives were beautiful. It was an ISO 50 film, and understanding, it's a subtle thing, but if you move the standards and throw the focus point is the tip of that calla lily on the left. And then what happens is with the spirals with the 2 stems, because they're losing focus, it draws your eye around. So that, you know, it's stuff like this. And, you know, I spent all summer doing this and focus throwing, experimenting with just cheap gear and whatever I could do to get by with it and make stuff that I liked. But it didn't really, I mean, anybody can do this, right? It's not going to separate you or take you out, which brings me to my next point is, and this is something that I got into after this, is that you must have a philosophy. So what do you mean by a philosophy? Well, when that summer, actually it was a couple years of doing this. I ended up, there was a job opening at the Dallas Museum of Art, and a friend of mine knew about it, and she called, she said, I think you'd be really good at this. And it was kind of a weird job without a good description. And it was going to be a little bit of computer coding, which I could handle, a little bit of photography, a lot of videography. And I'd never done video because video was really expensive back in the day. Sorry, I'm not used to talking this long. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity. I'm going to do it. And so I started working there. And at the time, podcasting, like the first time around, we're kind of in the second wave of podcasting now, but the first wave of podcasting was a big deal. Sorry, one more. It's very dry in here. And I talk really fast. But video podcasting was part of that. And they wanted to do some video podcasting about works in the collection. And they said, can you do this? And I just said, yeah. I didn't know how to operate a video camera. I mean, I knew photography, so how hard could it be, right? And then I realized it was doomed because I didn't understand, shutter angle and all these other things, even though we had digital cameras. So I needed a project where I could make mistakes. I needed something I could totally go home and screw up on the weekends. And that way, when I came to work, I knew what I was doing. So I thought, I'm going to start a little photography podcast because that's what I'm into. And it was kind of something that didn't exist and I wanted to exist. So I thought, well, here's an opportunity to make something. I thought I would do about 10 of these and I would release them. So I understand the whole process, shooting, editing, planning it, and then actually publishing it online. I needed to know the whole thing, making sure that an RSS feed worked out. And so I started doing these like in the evenings, and that was 13 years ago and 200 something videos ago. And I still do it today. So that was the beginning of the art of photography. And that's where it went. And the way it worked is that I did that for another 7 years and it grew and I had enough subscribers and I thought maybe I could have a go at doing this full time. So in 2014, I left the museum and went out on my own and have been here ever since. Now, when I say you need a philosophy, this is why I mentioned that, because it occurred to me when you start seeing more YouTube channels pop up and around, and today there are many, is that it's just like with still images. And I think a lot of people can relate when we talk about Instagram. A lot of times you feel like you're just throwing stuff into an echo chamber. And let's kind of be honest, you are, unless you have something that differentiates you as a person or an artist. I think that is what's going to make you successful. Mine was, I knew I could talk about composition. I knew I could talk about art. I was very comfortable with those things, and a lot of other people could not. And so that was my angle. That was my edge. And I'm not saying you have to be controversial with a philosophy, but it does help to draw a line in the sand with opinions from time to time. And one video that I did years ago was one called "Nobody Cares About Your Photography." That ended up, I did it. It was weird. I thought of the idea and I thought I was done for the day. And I thought, let's just record something. I did it in like 1 or 2 takes and put it up, and it just blew up. It was one of my bigger videos at that time. And obviously it has a confrontational title, which is largely why, but it was based on a true story. And it was a friend of mine who lives in New York that I met through doing the show. I was visiting him once and we met up in, I guess it was in Chelsea, and walked all the way to Brooklyn to get pizza. And so we had this long walk. We were having this great conversation about photography, and Matt's a really good photographer and lacks in confidence a lot of times. And I try to tell him and excite him and inspire him somewhat just because I'm his friend. But he was telling me, and he's only been shooting a few years, but he says, I was going to get a Squarespace website. I wanted to do that. I was getting all excited. And I'm like, why? Nobody cares about my photography. And that's where the title came from. And we talked about that. And that's what's going to differentiate you. You have to have an opinion about something. You also have to understand that, like, people literally will pull that video up, they'll see the intro, and then they leave a nasty comment. Well, you're a jerk. What the hell do you know? And this is real positive. They don't watch the whole thing because they don't have any attention span, I guess. But it's only a small group of people that do that. But you're going to annoy people on one side, and it becomes polarizing, and I don't think it's a good idea to, like, I limit how polarizing I'm willing to be. But I think something like that is important because for me personally, I know a lot of people, you don't actually know me, you watch the videos and stuff, but behind the scenes, I'm a perverse realist about things. Like, I think it's really important and essential to have ambitions, goals, dreams, things you want to do in life, because that's what gives you a drive, right? But where I see people mess up on that is they get lost in that dream and they can't differentiate the dream from where they are now. And that's the only way you're going to get from point A to point B, is if you have a very clear definition of what point A is, what point B could look like, and then what is the fastest way to get there. Now, I'm not any good at that. I stayed at the museum for 7 years. I probably should have been there for 3. And that's when I wanted to go do this, but I was so afraid that I would fail at it. I wouldn't, I didn't know what would happen. And so I tend to think things through and through and through. And I remember even it got to the end and it was like, you know, have you put in your notice yet? I'm like, no, I'm staying for this one last exhibition because I think it's really going to be whatever. I mean, there's always another one, right? But I think that that's really important though. And having the ability to be realistic and don't get caught up in the what ifs or the shoulds or the coulds. And I see people do that. I have friends that do that. There's not much I can do to help them because they get insulted, but they're making excuses so many times. There's always a reason you can't do something.
Well, I completely agree. I think if
you see it a lot through the school, I'm sure, you know.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But also like as a creative photographer, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned at the beginning, know where you're actually coming from. So I think that's the foundation. If you know where you're coming from, what your influences are, and almost like what your value system is, you can really project this into the future. And I think that is one of the elements that maybe a lot of talented photographers might be lacking. Yeah, so they are trying out maybe new projects a little bit into this direction or this or that. And in the end, they might not necessarily move a lot because they don't have a clear compass in terms of what their ultimate goals actually are. But if you analyze where you're coming from, what your heroes are, what makes them special, and if you create a philosophy out of this, then this can actually really show you a really clear path. It can give you a really clear indication, I think, in terms of where you want to be heading as a photographer.
Absolutely. No, and I think you nailed it too. I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, projects are definitely essential. Projects like, you know, the art of photography, my show was a project, right? That was one that succeeded. I've done many that never went anywhere. And that's okay. But you, like you're saying though, you have to, you have to have a drive and you'll know what turns you on eventually. I mean, what you really enjoy doing. I mean, that's kind of another factor is a lot of times if you're not enjoying it, you're not gonna do it. I mean, you know, it's just not gonna last. But yeah, and it's the determination. You have to have that philosophy, and you can't sit there and make excuses about things. There's always a reason, you know, and well, okay, get over it, you know. Yeah, well, this should be this way, or if that, here with, I'll use Instagram as the example because I think it's the number one thing that frustrates a lot of photographers. Well, I can't grow on Instagram because the algorithm or because this. Well, sure, okay, fine. Then you got to find a different way in, man. I mean, it's like you've got to. I don't know. What if you like too many things? Katarina says. I think that's kind of the point of my talk is that is my downfall, if anything, is that I love doing all kinds of different things. I love music. I love photography. I love video. I love people. I love, you know, and I've managed to find a niche. The art of photography probably is a good example of that because that is something that was able to tie together a lot of things for me. I never set out to do it, but I developed a smaller project that was an idea into something. What really caught my attention with the art of photography is that, you know, when I freelanced, and I have an enormous amount of respect for people who do commercial photography. My mentor, Greg Booth, was a commercial photographer. And we don't have time here, but there are some amazing stories of just bizarre things that would happen with clients. And the impressive takeaway is that Greg could always find a way to still be creative, get an impressive picture and make the client happy and stay successful all at the same time. And that's hard to do, all those things, you know. I always felt like as soon as clients, and a lot of it was I was working at kind of the bottom rung of very cheap work, but a lot of times clients would make unrealistic demands. And my personality is to kind of get offended and annoyed and I fly off the handle. Well, not literally, but you know, and then I kind of resent the client. I don't want to do it. And photography was always something that was just special for me. I didn't really want to do it for somebody else. And like I said, I have respect for people who do, and it's not easy. It's very impressive when you see people who are successful at that. But for what I could do, the other thing too, is when I started the art of photography, there was a noticeable, this was, I guess we were kind of at the tail end of, you remember when everybody was transitioning to digital from film. And that was a big deal because if you were a commercial photographer, you're looking at a studio overhaul that was expensive. And who's buying those film cameras? You know, you're not getting what you paid for them. And that was a traumatic thing, mixed with the fact that this was a time in the early 2000s, late 90s, where a lot of people weren't getting work. The stock was on the rise, and commissioned photography, the business was changing. And so I was able to look at it, and I knew a lot of people were successful at it. And with all due respect to them, I did not want to be in their shoes. And so here I thought, well, if I'm going to leave this museum job to go do this, how do we make money doing it? And then I realized, well, what if I were able to make the videos that I make? There's an advertising side to that is very different than doing a job for somebody. Clients are pretty easy to work with in my world. They give you talking points, you do it, and you're done. Sometimes there may be a small revision, but it's not a huge deal. And I didn't have to worry about that. But all of the creative, all the photography is mine. I control all of that. It has a downside to it too, because now I'm at a point right now where I feel like the show is a little stale and I need to start doing some new things and that's just me because I'm on the front line every day. But I think at one point, to Katerina's question though, what if you love too many things? I went back to doing some music, and I was actually doing scores for my own videos when I was doing travel stuff and I needed segue music. And I did that for a while, and it was just way too much work. So I had to stop. Plus, it's like, you can see the studio. It's like, how much more stuff can you cram in here? And like my desk, it's like I edit videos here and the keyboard's up on the wall. What am I going to bring the MIDI thing down? And it's just, you feel like it's just encroaching in on you after a while. So I had to draw a line somewhere and say, okay, I'm not going to do my own music right now. But maybe that's part of where it goes in the future. But you have to stay excited. The other point I want to make, Holger, that I think is a good segue is you were talking about heroes, people you look up to. And I think there's two things. One, it's important to have them. I see way too many photographers, and this was always very striking to me because somebody with a music background, when you're in music school, when you're in the 8th grade and you love Jimi Hendrix or Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd or whatever that is, and you go buy the records and that's how you learn how to play. You have an inspiration that drove what it is that you want to do. And I do not see that with photographers. I see it with painters. I see it with sometimes maybe dancers. I don't know. Maybe not as much, but photography, it blows my mind that people don't know it. And we're talking about understanding the history that came before you. Folks, photography is young, man. We're talking about maybe 200 years-ish. It was formally introduced in 1826. So we're not quite on the 200-year official daguerre recipe date. And you had examples like the Nestor Niepce picture, the rooftop, which was earlier, but we're looking at 200 years. And a lot of that, there was no technology change. Early on, there were only a handful of people who knew how to do it and got good at it. And so, like, if you want to go learn art history, I've got encyclopedia volumes in the other room that you can tear into. And I don't get into, I mean, it's a lot. I mean, you're talking about an enormous amount of history. Photo history, you can learn pretty quickly, and you can learn who the key players are. It expands when the technology expands and it becomes accessible to more people. But even then, I mean, there's schools of thought. There's, understanding pictorialism or understanding Group F64, which was tired of pictorialism. So they're moving out west and they're doing stuff in California that's landscapes that are presented a certain way. Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham, Win Bullock, people like that. And that's, again, during that summer where I was kind of buried in the darkroom, any book or magazine or anything that I could get my hands on. We still had magazines back then. I guess we still have those now, but you go into the Barnes and Noble, they're Borders. We had all the stores, and that's what I would do. This is kind of nerdy of me on Friday night, is I would go grab Subway or something and then go over to Borders and grab a coffee and sit down with all the books, because they had a great book selection, and look at the magazines. And so I started to see, man, this guy's really good, or this woman's amazing. Or, you start to pick out people who they've got something you like that like you identify with, right? Tom Burrell was a huge one for me. And he wasn't ever a big name in the art world. I mean, he was Robert Mapplethorpe's printer for all the big works that he did in the 80s. And Burrell went out on his own, and he was really big in the gallery scene, like in the 90s, huge. But he was working with, what I loved about Burrell, he was working with collodion and with pinhole, and with all of these techniques, doing a modern style with historical process. And you've always had people who, like, they're the history guys, like the Civil War buffs who show up for the reenactments in the US and then they shoot wet plate. And it's just a cover band, right? But here's Burrell that's taking old techniques and he's doing modern work with them. And there's a weird mid-century nod to people like Carl Blossfeldt and a lot of those things. And Carl, he was doing botanical photography for books and lectures and for medical implication, and not, or scientific work, not for art. And they were rediscovered later as that. But anyway, you figure out who these things are, and the thing that you have to do at some point is you've got to find a way to meet your heroes too. It's a weird rite of passage that I believe in, but when I did the artist series, that's how that came together. There was a series that when I went back to graphic design school briefly, I was studying composition, there was a guy who was a web designer who had gotten really interested in video, and he did a series of documentaries on designers that was really good. And I always looked at that and I thought, I would watch them over and over, and I thought, these are just so inspiring. I mean, I want to go work after this. I want to go make stuff. And I thought, man, somebody should do this with photography. And it was always in the back of my mind to do that. And then when 2015 rolled around, and it was there was a startup company that was doing crowdfunding type things, and they talked me into it. And they said, would you be interested in doing this thing? The art, what would you like to do? What would you like to crowdfund? I thought, well, let me try and do one video. I thought, no, well, maybe we could do this thing called the artist series. And so I have an audience to reach out to, and you have rewards and incentives for people to donate at various levels. And I was terrified. I didn't know what it would do or how it would go. And so anyway, I got overfunded, and I can't remember what the final number is offhand. I think it was, after they take their cut, I think it was around $17,000 that I had, which for me was a huge amount of money. And I'm like, and the shrewd businessman would say, okay, well, we've got a little extra, so we can do more of these later. No, the idiot Ted says, we're going to spend every dollar of that. And I wasn't paying attention. I actually put money into it myself. But it was so worth it. It was amazing. And I remember after it was funded, I thought, well, I better start working on this. And I didn't know, what am I going to do? I mean, I hadn't even thought about it, right? And so literally it's finding emails for people in very odd ways. Like sometimes I would go, if they didn't have contact info on the website, William Wegman's a good case of this. So I went to his website, I ran a who is query on the internet to find out who owned the domain. And it was his wife, who's his manager. And so that's who I emailed. So I got to him, but you have to dig for that, right? But it's there. I mean, you could have found it. Anybody could find it, but you have to be a little bit creative. And Wegman was so cool about it. He was very into it. Actually, I had hit him up a few years ago just to do something for the show when I was in New York, and we never were able to make it work out. But I told him I got funded for this thing because he was the first. And so I got him. Another guy was David Brookover, who is an amazing landscape photographer, lives in Wyoming. And I know David because he actually watches my videos. So that was an easy yes. So I got another one. And I kind of went down that way. And then like Laura Wilson was real difficult. Laura Wilson, nobody really knows who she is, but she was actually Richard Avedon's assistant when he did the American West series. And her sons are Owen and Luke Wilson, who are very famous actors. So it's an interesting family. But she's super picky about what she'll do. And it was funny because after I did the interview, I have this on tape somewhere. So I finished up the interview and she goes, okay, are we done? Are we done? Okay. And a lot of, we need to go back. I'm just getting into my groove of talking. So she takes herself very seriously, and should. And her home is an art gallery. She's got Henri Cartier-Bressons. I mean, it's a wealthy family. So they've got, but she has Richard Avedon portraits of the kids in football outfits when they were young of Owen and Luke Wilson. They're on the walls. It's mind-blowing. And she's an incredible photographer. I mean, just brilliant. There's a series on stuntmen that she's working on right now. And anyway, so we get to the end of the interview and she says, okay, are we done? Are we done? So, yep, we're done. She goes, an observation, but I need the cameras off. And I thought, oh no, what have I done? So I turned the cameras off, power them down. I said, what's up? And she says, well, I really don't remember why I said yes to this. And I thought, oh shit, here we go. And she said, but you've got something really going on. Now you need to be interviewing the very best of the very best. Do you have William Eggleston? I said, can you get me William Eggleston? She goes, no, I don't know him. But she said, why don't you go to Memphis and hang out? Because I hear you'll see him now. And then I'm like, oh my God, I wish I could. I mean, that would be fun. but it was really nice to have that vote of confidence. Keith Carter was another one that just a hero of mine for years. Emailed him through his website and he wanted to do it. Now, the tough one is when I got into Mexico. I had a friend, well, he's a friend now, but it was a guy who watched my videos, and he said, I know you're doing this artist series. He said, I'm in this photo group and we know Pedro Meyer, and I think you do it if you want to come to Mexico City. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll come down to Mexico if we can find a way to do maybe 1 or 2 more so I can get 3, maximize the trip. And we did. And we got Graciela Iturbide, who is another one of my, I mean, meeting her was like going up the mountain to talk to the monk about the meaning of life. I mean, that's how she is with me. I mean, she was Bravo's student for a long time, Manuel Alvarez Bravo. That was just, if there was ever a weak-kneed, giggly moment of being completely starstruck, that was it for me. I mean, that's how she is, and she's real sweet. I'll show you some stuff in a second, but anyway, it was really hard with them because it's like you're talking to somebody that doesn't know who you are, and you don't. A lot of people would say, "Could you send me a link to some of the stuff you've done?" Well, I haven't done any of it. Yeah, so you're having to like kind of sell it that way, and I'm not good at selling things that way. But I really, there was no one who said no. There were a couple that I couldn't do because of scheduling, and it's just Hiroshi Sugimoto is one that I wanted in there really bad, but he spends half his year in Tokyo, and so I couldn't make it that far. Fan Ho is another one who's a brilliant Chinese American photographer, and we had it set up, and he actually passed away before we could do it. He saw the video that I did on him, and this was around the time when I first contacted him. There was an Ebola breakout in Dallas, and it was somebody who had been to Africa, and it was one incident in the entire country, 700 million, one incident, and he flipped out. We have to postpone until and fair enough. So I respected that, but unfortunately, he did not live for that to happen. But anyway, let me show you some of the artist series stuff behind the scenes, just because this was me meeting my heroes, right? And so this was such an important, I don't know, time in my life, and it was kind of all in the course for 1 year. So it was amazing. Here's Bill Wegman in his studio. William Wegman is, if you're not familiar with his work, he started out as a conceptual photographer in the 1960s, did just some brilliant post-surrealist conceptual work. And then a lot of those included these video pieces with his dog, Man Ray. And there were these, like, this is pre-Instagram, right? So there are these like 1 minute long clips. You can find them on YouTube if you just look up William Wegman on YouTube, and they're all black and white things. They looked like they were filmed on closed circuit TV. He was in art school at the time. Man Ray is his dog's name. And Man Ray obviously is gone now, but he fell into this niche with the dogs, and you can see the pictures in the back. This led him down a bizarre road of a lot of commercial work. He worked for Sesame Street. When I was a kid, you used to see the dogs doing the numbers and letters, and it was a popular show in the US. And anyway, I went to his studio. He's enormously successful. He owns this whole building in Chelsea. And we go in, and he was signing some prints. The print he's signing is actually a Polaroid. Back when there were only a couple of these cameras in the world, but Polaroid made these cameras, and they would lease them to pro photographers who wanted to use them. It was a 20 by 30, I believe, inch. And so that's like a Polaroid is what he's signing. It's amazing. And they're brilliant. And he shot a ton of that stuff. Dogs everywhere. This is Topper. He was attached to me the entire time I was filming, which was super sweet. They're all Weinereiters, which are amazing dogs. His sister Flo is around. This is the work that Bill's doing now and wanted to talk about. This is bizarre. So he's got this weird collection of old vintage postcards that people send him, and he pops them up onto a canvas and paints the connections between them with this weird, almost De Goya style to them. And they're bizarre, but they're really cool. And so again, 3 floors of this building, we did the interview in the art studio, and then we went down later on this elevator. That's my assistant who helped on this project, Blake, on the left. The dogs are in the elevator, and that's Bill Wegman's son in the back, who was working on a computer startup in the basement or something. So we go down to the basement. He has this whole costume shop where this was all done for the Sesame Street sets and everything else. And you dress the dogs up. So we put old Topper on the bench there, and my assistant acted like he had human hands and all the bizarre things that Wegman's known for, which was amazing. Alexey Titarenko, this was the next day. And Alexey, Russian photographer who known for those long time-lapse shots. I should have put one in here. If you don't know his work, look him up. He's in the artist series. But he shot those at the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. He and I connected on a very weird level. We're close in age. We both have a music background. He used to be a librarian for an orchestra in Russia, has formal training in piano. Huge fan of a lot of the composers that I liked at that point, Shostakovich being one of them, and it's a big part of the video. Anyway, so this is the basement of his apartment in Harlem, and you come down the stairs and he has, it's hard to see from this photo, but behind on the left, it's an art gallery and then a dark room on the right, and you just shut out all the lights and print, and it's amazing. But Alexey, we had a lot of preliminary discussions about this video, and the whole thing is about the connection with music. And his was when you take the slow movements of the Shostakovich piano concerto, I believe it is, no, cello concerto. You take the slow movements of that, to him, that spoke to him kind of visually, not only in terms of the form, but mainly the tempo. And he felt that that equated to long exposure. So when he started doing those photos of workers and people commuting in the Soviet Union, he said it was a very dangerous time too. I mean, in America, at least, my recollection as a kid is that, whoa, communism, Soviet Union's fell and Russia's going to be independent. And what we were not shown in the media was how the ruble crashed and crime rose and gang violence rose. And he was privy to all that, and a lot of why he, is no longer there. But he did a very important series of work from that time. Had the Hasselblad, I mean, very low key in terms of equipment, but we were able to actually film him doing some bleaching work. And this is all in the video, but it's my assistant shooting him, but he's doing some, you can actually go on a finalized print and actually bleach out parts to change tonality. It's kind of like toning, and he was doing some toning work too. So anyway, that was great. This is David Brookover, and I just love this photo because it's hilarious and ridiculous. But David lives in Wyoming. The last day we were there shooting, I mean, my God, their backyard is just like beautiful. The Teton Mountains are back there. And I wanted to get some B-roll because all we had was interview. And sometimes I need stuff for cutaways if I make an edit that's going to be a jump cut or awkward. And so I said, well, can we go outside and just do some shooting? And he said, yeah. I said, let's take the 8x10 camera out there, because he still shoots 8x10 film. And the guy under the hood over there is Joe DeFiglia, he was very sweet and very instrumental in this even happening. He owns a home in Jackson and allowed all of us to stay there. And this is in the backyard. And so Joe's an excellent photographer as well, but he's never shot large format. So I just said, David, just give him a lesson on large format. And I'm going to walk around. I'm going to do some stills. I'm going to do some B-roll. So that's what we did. And you can see it in the final. But anyway, he was having him look through the hood. And I just find that hilarious. I thought it was awesome. This gets down to Mexico. I have way too long a story about Pedro. He's a crotchety old man, but brilliant. He kind of sizes you up and decides if he likes you or not. And he was interrogating me in the middle of the interview, which got really weird. So he started talking to me, and I'm like, well, I'm interviewing you, but whatever. And so he says, well, if you have this little project you're doing. He was very fascinated by the artist series. He said, well, so you're talking to me, he knew the other photographers. And he said, so how do you know if you've won? And I said, how? And I don't know if you guys have the TV ads in England, but in the US, we have these ads for Dos Equis with this guy who looks like that. And he's the most interesting man alive. And he has this deep voice. And that's how he sounds. And he's just like the most interesting man alive. And so he says, how do you know if you have won? And I said, what do you mean win? And he says, well, in football, you have a score. One team has this many points, one team. How do you know if you have won? And I said, I don't know. I said, well, I know if I've won, if a couple people watch these videos and no, you do not understand. How do you know if you've won? I maybe Netflix picks this up. That would be a win. He goes, no, that is not. How do you know if you've won? This went on for 30 minutes. And I was starting to get a little irritated because we're rolling. I only have so many cards, And so I'm playing with him, whatever. And so I get to the end and I finally got a little fed up. And I said, Pedro, I said, Mr. Meyer, I said, I have no idea. How do you know if you have won? He goes, if one or two people watch this and they have a takeaway, you have won. I'm like, that's like the first thing I said. But it was funny. And he was very nice. And at the end, well, it was funny. At the end, I really needed to use the restroom after this. And he has a beautiful home that we're out in the courtyard out in the back, which, the sounds of birds and police helicopters the whole time. So this was a hard one to cut. But I finally said, can I go in and use your restroom? I'm sorry. And he goes, oh yeah, second door on the left. And I go in there and he's got a Diane Arbus print over the toilet, which I thought was just hilarious. And one thing I started to notice that in Mexico, all these photographers, every inch of their homes have photos of well-known work on them. They are so enthusiastic about photography. It's just funny to see them in the bathroom sometimes. I think though, with his personality, I think Arbus in the bathroom was intentional, but that's just me. That's Pedro. He was wonderful. And I got a big hug when I left. And so I knew I had won, I guess. But I left one of those in the video. I said, you'll hear him say, how do you know if you won? I didn't put them all in, but this is Graciela. I mentioned going up to the top of the mountain and meeting the mouth of God here. That's what she is for me. She's a brilliant photographer. She had to have a smoke before we started. And those shoes are dynamite. They're lifts. But she has a little courtyard in the back, and she was just wonderful. One of the smartest people I have interviewed, and very sweet. What's interesting is she does not speak any English. I do not speak any Spanish. We had to have a translator for this. She does speak 5 languages, just no English. I could have done it in German. But in her bathroom, there's Paul Strand under the sink, of all places. But I thought that was interesting too. But anyway, the woman on the left is a friend of my friend Doug's, who brought me down there and talked me into doing this. And I told him, I said, we're going to interview Graciela. We need a translator. And he says, I'll find you one. Done. Don't worry about it. I'm like, uh-oh. So if this were left up to me, I probably would have spent some money, hired a professional translator. That's Ruth. And Ruth is a culinary consultant in Mexico City. She used to be a chef, and she was really good, apparently. But if Gordon Ramsay or Jamie Oliver, any of the big chefs are doing a TV show and they're covering world foods and they go to Mexico, this is who they call to find out who's who on the food scene. And she was really interested in doing this. And I bought her several nice dinners. We were very appreciative, but she was wonderful. So this worked out so good because she and Graciela immediately latched onto one another, and they start having all this inside banter and conversation. I had to tell them, we got to start this interview, but it worked out great because she trusted my translator. And I think she was willing to talk about some work that was very difficult psychologically. There's a thing where she runs across a dead body. It's in the video. She opened up and let me do that in the end. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that we had kind of more of a family vibe going in there with somebody she was interested in talking to, and wasn't a professional translator. And so I thought that was kind of a key takeaway. That's Ruth. We're in a Mexican restaurant. We're bowls and mezcal and all kinds of fun things. This was a meetup I did in Mexico, and I've done meetups over the years when I travel, and they're always really special. And I wanted to give a shout out to this group because usually when you do meetups, people show up and they want to go shoot. They want to hang out. They want to do all that stuff. Well, this group shows up and they all bring cases of work, and they're all students, and they were all doing darkroom work, and they want to sit there and show me their portfolio. It was amazing. It was like the enthusiasm that was coming out of that crowd. All of them were like that. And nobody knew one another. I thought, are y'all at the same school or something? Nope. They just all wanted to share their work, which I thought was really cool. And then finally, this is Lourdes Grobet, who did a whole docu-series on Lucha Libre wrestling. And that's Blue Demon behind her in the painting. But she was amazing. And you just go to their house. And I don't know, you have this idea in your head that, like, a lot of your heroes are going to be these rock star types of people. And to me, they are, but yeah, they live like everybody else. And it's, But finally, Keith Carter, that was me in his studio. And of course, you get over there and you realize that this studio, like all of his shots that you've looked up to over the years, you've noticed parts of that backdrop. This is where he shoots everything. So it's a wild kind of thing to be able to go do. But a lot of times, people will show you work, and this is a new color series he's doing, which is digital, which is very different and unique for him. He's always done more historical processes, silver gelatin, things of that nature. But anyway, that's Artist Series. Holger, I felt like I cut you off a minute ago. Did you have something you were going to tell me?
No, that's all good. Absolutely enjoying this. Fantastic.
Well, the reason, and I feel like I'm just showing slides like from my vacation. And that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that you've got to find a way to meet people that you look up to. And the way I look at it is this, is if you're going to be successful, and you're going to get what you want out of life. And I'm not talking about being famous. I'm just talking about if you're going to be successful in terms of what you're getting out of your work creatively or your own creative ambitions, because this is first and foremost about making things and being creative. And I think that that's a really important thing that you've got to be able to do is who are you surrounding yourself with? Now, I remember reading books where people are like, oh yeah, you should reach out to people who are successful and just cold call them but have some questions ready. And I didn't want to do that. So I went at it from a huge pain angle because it took a year and a half to do and was an enormous amount of work, but it was worth it to me because like I still keep in touch with Alexey Titarenko. His birthday's the day after mine, which was a couple of weeks ago. So I call him, and Wegman I haven't talked to, Keith Carter I talked to, Brookover I talk to all the time. Like he just called me last night. In fact, he's supposed to be in here. He calls me and says, I just registered for your talk. And I'm like, oh, no pressure, right? So, but it's very sweet. But it's exciting to be able to know some of those people, and especially with somebody like David, who I am fairly close to. If you ever have a question or need a resource, or it opens up doors and opportunities to you. Like for instance, with David, when we filmed his video, he introduced me to the printers that he was working with that work out of Arizona, and I've been to Arizona a few times. We've done projects together. And like one thing leads to the next, and it just opens up different things. But I think if you approach somebody that you look up to, I think you need to look serious, and you don't want to look too intense because people get calls. I get them for the art of photography. People want to like come intern and stuff, and I don't know. You get so much of that. You got to, again, having that philosophy, you got to stand out some way. But I think like, in my case, having a docuseries that I was working on was my in on that, and I want to do it again. I just, it's time, money, and everything else. And COVID certainly hasn't.
Yeah. And did you get those inspiring moments that you were hoping for? Sometimes one evening with the right person can change the direction that your life takes.
That's what you want. Yeah.
One person in this one moment, everything fits together, and you can almost tell in this moment, wow, my life has just now taken a turn into a slightly different direction.
Yeah, it gets exciting.
You met those artists.
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to explain. It just gets exciting. And it also, I guess from an ego perspective too, it also makes you realize that when they reciprocate in a way that they're not being phony with you, they're legit. And that, you get a little bit of, I'm gonna tell you something really stupid. I'm on Instagram like everybody else. And I put up a photo one time and the nature of how I work, I try not to do this, but it's really hard to avoid at some level. But like, I'll be honest, I almost quit doing this after the artist series at one point, because the artist series was my passion. It was my, I put everything into that, and it's only one series. And, I thought, well, it'd be great if like Netflix or somebody would think this is a cool idea. I don't know. I mean, that was one person who made all that. And I had an assistant on a handful of shots. Graciela's interview in Spanish, the only way I could edit that, I don't speak Spanish. I had to find a way to do it. So I got online and I ordered from a translation company. They sent me everything in Spanish. And the interview is an hour and a half long. And so I printed it all out, and I'm making notes, and I ran every sentence through Google Translate. This is so stupid. I should have just hired somebody to do it, or to help me with it at least. But I can't make the cuts unless I know exactly what she's saying. Otherwise I'll cut her in the middle of a sentence and I'll hear about it, and I don't want to do that. So I did everything, and then I translated it back into English, and you realize how wrong Google Translate is a lot of the time. And a couple of times I had to ask friends that did speak Spanish, what does it mean when you use this word, but I got it. And then I did the subtitles for it. And what was cool is my friend Patricia Conde, who owns an art gallery in Mexico, who's a very, very close friend. She's wonderful. She's somebody that I trust who is Mexican, and it needed to be somebody from Mexico too. And so I said, can you, and the other thing is Graciela's got an odd accent. It's unusual. I didn't know because I don't speak Spanish, but that's what I was told later. And anyway, so I called up Patricia and I said, can you proof my subtitles? And she said, yeah, they're perfect. I had to change one word, and that was it. And it wasn't even that big of a deal. It could have gone in. But anyway, so I was very proud of that. But I got way off track on that. But I don't remember what we were saying about meeting your heroes. But it's an important thing to do. And you never know where that's going to lead. Oh, I was going to say, I almost quit after the artist series. Well, you put all this passion into something, and they don't do that well. you put them up online and they only get a couple thousand views. Now that sounds like a really jackassy, arrogant thing for me to say, but you're thinking these need to be some of my bigger videos. And so you compare them to the rest of your work. But that's the problem with all the social media and the online stuff is it messes with your head, because back in the day when you did commercial work or you did a gallery opening, there's no view count, but you can go to any one of my videos and my view count's on there. So you can see what stuff's getting views or not. And as a creative, that bothers you. I think we all deal with it with Instagram. You put one image up and it gets 100 likes. Great. And you get another one, you put it up and it gets 2 likes. And you're like, what happened? And anyway, one time, this was a couple of months ago, I put an image on Instagram that I was really proud of, that I thought was cool. And I'd worked on it. I mean, it was kind of a concept I'd thought through, and conceptual work and Instagram are not buddies. You need pictures of flowers that are over contrasty, and that's what people love. But anyway, this was very different. It didn't do that well. And I was going to bed and I was checking it one more time. Maybe it took off. This is so unhealthy to do, by the way. Do not do this. I struggle with this all the time. But I looked on there and Keith Carter gave it a like. And I'm like, that's all I needed to see. And that was one of my heroes liking my stuff. And that meant something to me, you know? And so I should have done a 6th section on here, which is perspective, which is important to have because it's so easy to lose when you get into the internet and technology. And that's the world I live in. But the last thing I want to go into before we change over and we're going to have a little back and forth with music stuff. And then we're going to open this up for questions if we still have anybody here. The number's still high. I'm impressed. This is weird because I'm at home. I put on shoes for this so I would feel like I'm at least, you know, up and at it or whatever. But anyway, so the last thing I want to talk about is understanding your time and place, or place and time, however you want to interpret that. This is important because if there's one thing that I have noticed in doing this, and I mentioned earlier that the history of photography, you're looking at 200 years. You can get a book and start going through it tomorrow. It's not difficult. It's not hard, but you would be amazed at how many people just won't do it. And I know some of it you may not be interested in, but for me, when I started doing a lot of the historical stuff, it was because I had looked at Tom Burrell's work. And he was by far my favorite guy at that point. And he was doing all the historical process in a modern setting. And there was something just mojo cool about that. You know, it's like, man, that dude was just dripping mojo. And I'm like, I want to be, because it looked intelligent, right? So it's like, yeah, you've got a modernist spin on a historical approach. And at that time in my life, it's like, yeah, I need to be hitting that too. So that's what I did. I went into, oh, and sidetrack here once again. Tom Burrell is an interesting story too. I have met him. He's hard to find because he's disappeared. He was no longer in New York. I did a lot of Googling and I found something about a pizza company in Florida. Well, Tom Burrell is in the pizza business in Florida, in Sarasota. So when I went out there a couple of years ago to do, I have 2 more artist series videos that are unreleased, and I don't want to talk about it because it's frustrating and they will get there. One is with Clyde Butcher, who's an amazing landscape photographer. Well, I go down to interview Clyde and I got a plan. And I'd emailed Tom. Well, I couldn't find his email anymore, so I didn't think it was the same address. Anyway, whatever. So one night I found out they had this pizza truck and they would go to these area bars and they would set up out front and serve pizza. And so I figured out who his wife was, and she's a chef, a very renowned chef. And she was in New York for a long time and had studied, Neapolitan pizza styles, and became like the person on that in the US. And so they wanted to get away. They were tired of New York. So they decided to move down to Florida and try and open a restaurant, but they started with this truck. And so I go over to the truck, I found it. And I went up to the front and I see Tom, he's back there. I'm nervous again. And he's back there shoving pizzas in the oven. And this is the great Tom Burrell making pizzas, right? And you got to understand, this thing is styling. It's like a 1957, it's first class. It's not ghetto. It's the real deal. And so I put my order in and she said, okay, so what do you want? I said, this is what I want. And I'm going to have a beer. And she said, great. She said, you'll get that inside. She said, we'll call you in a second when it's ready. I said, well, I've got a confession I want to make. I said, I came all the way from Texas to see that man over there. She goes, which one? I said, Tom Burrell, the famous photographer. She goes, Burrell, get your ass over here. This is his wife. So he came over and he was blown away. He couldn't believe it. This is how he knew me. When you Google his name, my old video comes up as the first subject. And I think he probably didn't like Googling his own name and seeing me come up. And he was like, I know who you are. And I said, man, I hope it was a good video. It's not bad. It's not bad. And I said, well, I just wanted to shake your hand. And man, you're such an influence on me. And I said, I think this is cool what you're doing. And he was so taken back. So I got my pizza. I had to go in to get a drink. So I'm sitting at the bar, and Tom and his wife come in, and they're at the other end of the bar, and they're just taking a break, I guess, from the pizza stuff. And next thing you know, he walks over, hands me another beer. He says, so let's talk. And we had the greatest conversation. It was amazing. And he told me, he said that they moved down to Florida. They wanted to open a restaurant. He said, you know, and again, this is back to like, you know, your culmination of everything that happens in life. He said something very sweet at one point. He said, my wife supported me when I did the art thing. And it was also time to support her while she wanted to do this cooking venture. And, you know, where I come from in music school, that is a really selfless and very sweet thing to give up. He says he still shoots. He just doesn't worry about the gallery scene dried up. There's a lot to it, you know. So it wasn't like this tragic end to, you know, or fall from grace. And he restored the truck himself. He's into all kinds of stuff like it. So it was just a really great conversation. But I thought it was just so freaking human to see somebody tell you that and be open about it, because, you know, you're in the art world, and, you know, the guy who couldn't make it or couldn't cut it. And I don't think I would have given him that vibe, but I mean, we talked for a while, and he just ended up being a really nice guy. And I said, would you ever consider doing an artist series video? And I told him about it, and he said, yeah. And he says, email me. He said, email me right now, so I have your address. Never heard back from him, but I also didn't push it because we kind of ran out of funding and time on artist series. But one day we'll get back to it. But understanding your place in time, and Tom's a prime example of that, is that, you know, you got to know what became before you. And Laura Wilson says this in the video that I did with her. And she said that's part of the problem, is that young people come up now and you realize, I'm sure you see this all the time, you realize early on that you've got some natural ability to take an interesting picture that your friends compliment you on, let's say. So you've got a little bit, there's a spark there, right? There's something there. And then you start to see people start getting crazy and experimental, and they don't realize, one, that was done in the 60s on a much higher level. So that's another reason you need to understand what came before. And then I also think that this can start to drive your work in new directions. And after moving to digital, one of the things that was a big deal for me was I was always, even though those images, I think, are just a collection of flowers in a lot of ways, I was playing to the medium. And so you see things that are done with the photo. Anyway, a lot of that doesn't happen in the digital world the same way. And a couple of years ago, I did a project with Phase One, who make very high-end cameras that I'll never be able to afford. Anyway, they had a what they call an achromatic back, which is a full spectrum digital sensor. So just to be short about this, with the light spectrum, you have the visible spectrum. That's what the human eye can see. And then you've also got infrared and ultraviolet. Well, any digital camera, so even in your phone, we all have a sensor, right? Whether it's a phone or a camera. And we all look at the sensor, and it's just it's a black hole, right? And you don't really see much detail on there or anything. It has like kind of a red, everybody's afraid to touch it because you're gonna break it, right? Well, there's several layers of things on there. There's a glass layer on there, and there's several filters on there. The sensor actually can see things that your eye can't. And so what we do to bring that back to reality is there's the Bayer filter, which separates it into the color channels. That's how we get color photos. There's also an infrared filter, or they call it an IR cut. It's an infrared cut, which basically cuts it off at the visual spectrum. May let a little in, but I can't remember offhand. And then UV low pass filter, keep out UV light, which probably isn't that big of a threat. And then you have sensor glass over the top. So this sensor on the Phase One, they call it achromatic. It only shoots black and white, but it's full spectrum. So if you want to control that, you have to buy filters. And I should have brought these down for this. They're in the other room. But there's one that's just they call it an IR cut filter. It's what they took off. You're putting it back on over the lens, and it basically cuts out the infrared. So I can shoot black and white, or actually the color filter is still on the camera that I had converted. So you can shoot color still, and it brings it back into reality. Or you can put in infrared filters, and then it translates light differently into the digital form, into what you see. So for instance, if you shoot an image of blue sky, goes black. Trees, because they radiate infrared light, or they transmit infrared light, go white. And so this was a huge deal for me. Now I can't afford the $63,000 phase one, and the lenses all start at like 10 grand. So forget it, you know. But I, a couple of years ago, started doing a lot of work with Sony and got to know the marketing group over there really well. And we were at Photo Plus a couple of years ago and may or may not have had some beer. And anyway, we were having a long conversation. And I asked about the IR thing, and they said, if you want to, do you have an old camera you want converted? And I said, yeah. They said, just call El Dean tomorrow. And so I did. I called him when I got home. And it was funny because they said, okay, here's your thing. Put it in a box, put this label on it, and make sure this number's on here so they know. So I put it in the mail. 2 days later, it's back. And I thought, well, crap, it probably got returned. I don't know. It was done. Like they did it for me like that. And so I've got, it's an old NEX7, but it's IR converted. Let me show you real quick what this did for me. So understanding infrared photography and also understanding from a historical perspective, this kind of was a very happy accident that happened one day. But I was in Arizona, and a friend negotiated this balloon ride. I'd never been on a hot air balloon before. 6 a.m. Actually, it was earlier now. It was about 5 a.m. Sun's barely coming up. And you have a limit on what you can carry on the balloon. And I just kind of wanted to enjoy the ride. So I thought, let's have some fun. I'll bring the infrared camera. I didn't know what I was going to get. So I had the infrared filter on here. It's like a 720 filter, 720 nm. And you put this on, and I thought, this is too dark. Nothing's going to radiate. Well, the trees go white, right? Well, there was a second hot air balloon on the ground. And so we start going up, and I'm deathly afraid of heights, but there's something so tranquil about a hot air balloon. You don't feel like you're going to die. If this was an elevator roller coaster, it would have been another story entirely. But it gave me a different look and perspective into things. I looked at it on the back of the camera, and I said, I think, and you don't see it quite like you're going to see it once you post-process it, but it's much different for infrared. But I thought, I think this has got a thing here. So I went on the whole ride. But anyway, you do these landscapes, and I'll talk about Ralph Gibson briefly in a second. And this bothered him because he didn't understand what infrared was. The light's not coming from the right direction. He thought I'd Photoshop this. And I said, no. And I couldn't kill it, because he said, do another take of this and get rid of the white trees in the front, because the light source is coming up behind these mountains over here. But you have a secondary infrared light source that's basically coming from the trees. But again, I think images like this, it's like my thought going into that image now is more of an Ansel Adams, or probably earlier, even like Edward Curtis or some of the early photographers that were doing the American landscape at that time, which was all wild and uninhabited. So anyway, but you take it through a modern thing with an infrared lens, and it becomes something just radically different. And so that's why it's really important to understand, what's come before you and where you are in time. I think another thing that I want to say very briefly on this, I knew this would happen. We get short on time, but I have a lot of people that contact me because they know I worked at an art museum, and they know that I talk about art photography, and they know that I know photographers and so on and so forth. And they know me through the show, and I get emails, and they would love me to either do a video on this, and I sort of have, or give them some direction because they want to make their living as an art photographer, and they want to be in galleries and museums. That doesn't exist anymore, folks. That ship sailed a long time ago. First of all, to be in a museum, you need to be dead. That helps a lot. And I don't think you'll get much enjoyment after that. If you want to be alive and work in a museum, you've got to be far out. And you have to, this is brutally honest, but you have to get in with the collectors, with the wealthy people who are going to buy your work to put into the Contemporary Art Museum. That's what it is. It's a game. Some of those people do good work. There's a lot of people who do junk, let's be honest. But that's what the game is. And it's set up to where we all believe that if you just do incredible work, it'll be rewarded that way. Those worlds are not set up like that anymore. Galleries are the opposite end of the spectrum because they are dependent on sales. Museums not. Museums make their money on grants, on a lot of public funding, some foot traffic and door sales, but they don't sell work, right? They're in the business of displaying work. Galleries sell work. You can probably do gallery gigs, but you have to understand that the gallery owner is going to want to take 50% of the cut, and you're going to have to produce enough work to do a show. My dad, who spent most of his career being an illustrator, wanted to get into fine art landscape painting. And he's really good at it. And he's done some shows, and he complains because he said that what you've got to do is you've got to sit there and work on a project for a year with no money on it and then hope that it sells after the opening. And he'll sell a few, but then if you don't sell them all, I mean, it's hard. And you need a good gallery person to be able to move that work for you. So if you're really willing to do that, you could probably ease your way into galleries. But honestly, why? You know, it's like the 1950s are over with. Everyone still looks at Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was a rock star in his time, but he was a man of his time, you know. He was who he was. He understood everything. All these points I made today, HCB knew him inside out, and he was of his time. He was realistic about where he was. He knew his ambitions. He was able to cultivate a very interesting style of photography that he could consistently repeat over and over. And I'm not saying that to be derogatory. I'm just saying it was always like, sometimes you see people and it's like, some duds in here. There's not a lot of duds with Henri Cartier-Bresson. They're just not. He was able to maintain that high level of consistency. But a lot of people will look at the 50s and they look at the galleries and they look at and they think that that's how it is. And it's done. It's over. There's this whole world of online stuff that, believe me, has not been cracked yet. We think it has, and we get caught up in the moments where we think it has. And like, if you were on Instagram in 2013 or 14, or right before Facebook bought them, yeah, you could grow. You get 1 million followers on there. You could get endorsement deals. You know, I wasn't that early to it. I didn't see it. And that's also the thing too. And the same with YouTube, is that it's like betting in the stock market. You don't know what the winning horse is going to be. It doesn't look like that at the time. And Instagram didn't look like it was a big winner at the time. I remember when Facebook purchased them and everybody thought, and a lot of people were mad because they thought, well, Facebook's going to ruin it, you know. But that platform has become so saturated. So there's got to be something else. And so you've got to be on the forefront of those things. That's where time, I think, is a little bit better spent, rather than obsessing about galleries or museums or things like that. That's just really important. The last thing I want to talk about, are we good on time?
Yeah, super.
Okay. People they're here, they're interested.
They're still here.
Run away screaming.
Everything.
Okay, so I'm used to 10-minute videos, man. This is an hour and a half. I feel like I'm command performance here. So the last thing I want to talk about, I have a very affectionate title for, and this is something that you and Katerina and Debbie and I were talking about when we did our pre-call the other day. But I think I don't want to get into a whole lot that's controversial, but this is not controversial. This is reality right now. And this is where everyone is. We're going to talk about the 100-year plague. And yes, I know if you're going to fact check me, it's not a plague. And we haven't had one exactly every 100 years, but I'm going to make a point about this. We're going to talk about what we've all gone through over the last year with COVID. This is a very unfortunate time that we have never seen. I can't remember what my next slide is. Okay. Before we're in uncharted territory here, folks, and we're not out of it yet. We have positive news, but it is what it is. And I remember when this was, okay, so in January, I was in New York City, actually February, I went to New York City for the launch of the Fujifilm X100V. I got invited to go up there, and that was a really cool trip. And the reason it was cool is that Fuji were very forthcoming with me. They said, well, we've got a camera we're introducing. We would love to have you come look at it, but we're going to be honest, we don't have a budget right now to bring press to New York. Sometimes they do. They did not on this one. They said, but if you wanted to come, I think they said we'd get your hotel or something. I can't remember. There was a little bit of incentive, but not much. And so I thought, you know what, screw it. I haven't just like shot in a while. And so I went up to New York and I spent a day or two working on their thing, but then the rest of the time I just shot. I mean, I was down on the streets, I was doing, and I got some cool shots from that area. You know, it was a cool trip. It was fun. And I remember coming home, and it was the last day of February, or maybe March 1st. And I was so sick. I don't know what the hell hit me. I take okay care of myself sometimes, but I mean, and I'll get colds or the flu. I was on that couch for 5 days. I didn't eat for 3 days. I was sick. I could not get that fever to break. And I mean, it was starting to get a little bit concerning. And finally it got over with. And the next thing you know, everybody's talking about this thing, COVID-19. And I thought, no way, there's no way it could have been. I don't know. I've never done the after the fact testing, and it's too late now. I was curious about it at one point, but I mean, I caught something. But my point is that you never know when something like this comes down the pike. It's horribly unfortunate. not just in terms, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir if I tell you about it. I mean, everybody watching here has had an experience and they know exactly what we're dealing with right now. So for me, early on, mixed with a lot of the unrest that we've dealt with in the US, I found myself in a really bad mix of, I'd finish work. First of all, I didn't even want to do videos. Like, this is something very serious, and I'm supposed to get on here and, hey guys, let's talk photography. You don't feel like it, and it's hard. And so I would work a little bit, and I would like plan videos, and I know, okay, I got to do this, and so I'd work on that, but then 5 o'clock would hit and I'm like, all right, I'm done with work for today. And I'd be sitting right here in this chair on this computer, and I would pull up Twitter and I'd start looking for the latest news. Like, the news can't deliver it fast enough. I got to see what people on the ground are doing. I'd grab a drink and I'd start getting so depressed. Twitter and booze are a lethal combination, and avoid it at all costs. Anyway, about a week into this, I realized, and I was so angry and irritated and uninspired. This isn't me, man. It's like, I know better. So yeah, dip back into your past again. But this is what I did. It's like, I remember there have been times in my life where I realized that, okay, first of all, I got to take better care of myself. I'm not exercising at all. I'm sitting in this chair all day. I'm not super heavy, but I wouldn't mind being a little more in shape. And I just don't feel good, you know? And so I thought the first thing I'm going to do is I want to go for walks. And I'd done this once before in my life. This has nothing to do with photography, but everything to do with it. You will see in a second. And I knew I needed to get positivity going in my ears. News diet, turn it all off. I know that we're all quarantined. I know all the restaurants are closed. I know I got to mask up to go to the store, you know, the whole thing. But I need time for me where I can get positivity going. So this is what I did. I decided I was going to go for walks. And I signed up for an audible.com account, and I needed some books on tape. That's what I was going to do. So I got a bunch of Tony Robbins. And if you guys aren't familiar with Tony Robbins, he's a motivational speaker, American. And it's self-help stuff, but I don't care what the content was. I needed the positivity, and I needed somebody who was excited. So Unleash the Monster Within, or whatever I read. And then I read another book that was a financial book that he'd written he's not a finance guy, but it was delivered in a way that I got interested in, like, things like, what is the stock market doing, and what does this mean, and what is the economy doing? And so it was create a stepping point for me to get off. And all of a sudden I realized within a week or two, I'm not winded while I'm out walking anymore. I'm at a faster pace. A friend of mine says, you need an Apple Watch. And I was like, no, I avoid the Apple Watch. I don't want another device that sends me texts, or, you know. He's like, well, how are you going to track your running? I said, I just run. He goes, how fast do you walk? As fast as possible. You know, he's being a tool with me. And so anyway, so I ended up getting an Apple Watch, and then I noticed that I'm improving. I'm walking faster. I'm finishing books. I moved on to another guy, Jim Rohn, who's this older motivational speaker. And this has nothing to do with photography, but it got me in a better place and a better mood. And one day I realized I had an opportunity to study privately with Ralph Gibson, who is one of my heroes. Ralph and I have met before. When I told Katerina, she's a big Ralph Gibson nut too, and I knew she'd be impressed. And she was like, I'm shocked. Yeah. And it was cool. And so I realized that this is and I don't have time right now, because I'd gotten positive and my schedule had picked up too. I thought work was going to slow down for me, and fortunately it did not. But anyway, I was in this groove of doing it, and I thought, I don't have time to do this. But I thought back to what I said before about being in music school, and when else are you going to have an opportunity to write for an orchestra? And I'm like, okay, now's the time. Let's do it. And it wasn't easy. And Ralph makes me work. And I'm taking a break right now, and I'm going to go back eventually and do more. He tells you things that are difficult to hear. And he set all that up in the very beginning. And I love Ralph. I mean, he is not a BSer. He was very frank with me, and he got me thinking about some new things, but he brought me back to the music idea. And I'm gonna go through some images really quick with you that I worked on with him. But Ralph, it took a couple lessons. We would do these on Zoom, by the way. He's in New York, upstate, or actually he's on Long Island, I think. They're not in the city right now, he and his wife. So we do these on Zoom, just like we're talking right now. And he'd show up, and he'd always have a guitar in the background. And he's just a great guy. He's so impressive. And so we would start looking at work. And about the third lesson in, he says, he forgot I had a music background. And he said, wait a minute. He said, all right, we're taking everything off the table, because we talked a little bit about composers, a little bit about music, and not about photography. He says, how do we get this into the visual realm? He said, how do we talk about things like, how do you express harmony? And so when you're in music school, you learn music theory and you learn how chords, chord progressions, or harmony works. And like, I think the easiest version is you see this in blues music or country music, where you have a lot of them where the harmonic structure is the same in any song. Melodies change, tempo changes, other things, but the harmonies, like there's an expectancy of a certain 1-4-5 chord progression that happens within these realms. But it's defined, right? And so you have, you know, the what we call the tonic, which is the bass chord of the major scale, right, or a minor scale. And then you have what we call subdominant and dominant. Now these are big weird names, but subdominant, sort of its function is to eventually wind up to the dominant, which is the point of tension that wants to resolve back to the tonic. And so that's the if you break it down to two, it's dominant tonic, so or 5-1 or whatever you want to look at that. It's the tension resolution. Okay, so you have this chord and you want it to end, so the song doesn't end on that chord, right? Because that leaves you hanging. So you want to go back to the other one. So how do we talk? How do you visualize that? And I said, okay, that's interesting. I'm thinking about it. He said, that's what you're going to do this week for your assignment. He said, I want a bunch of work. You're going to work your ass off. I'm like, okay. He said, and you're going to shoot with a 50mm lens and a rangefinder. And I'm like, I'm not buying a Leica, Ralph. You're off rocker on that. I already spent money on it. Anyway, so I didn't do that, but I didn't with a 50mm lens. And I said, I'm curious, Ralph, why 50? He said, look at all the famous photographs that have been taken with 50mm lens. He said, there's just too many of them. He said, work with that. Learn that first. To him, each focal length has its own voice, and they do. He works a lot right now with 135, but it's really interesting. He said, all my famous shots that I'm known for were all on a 50. That's all you need. You know, and so I said, okay, great. So I got on this. He said, the other thing I want you to think about is I want you to think about, you know, all the Italian descriptive terms that Beethoven and you know, the great musicians used to use, like allegro non troppo, largo. What do these mean? Well, largo means slow. There's a delivery to it. There's a pacing. Allegro is very upbeat and fast. Andante is more of a walking tempo, and so on and so forth. He said, so how do you create that in, you know, visually? So that's what I went to work on, and I will share with you guys. And I'm not super comfortable sharing these because they're not, well, they are serious work, but I'm just not comfortable with them yet, I guess is what I'm saying. But this is what I went for, was a sequence approach. And so if you look at the harmonic metaphor, so we have, you know, subdominant, dominant, and then resolution of the tonic. So how does this resolve? Well, series of monarch. This is actually not a monarch butterfly. I was corrected by somebody recently on this, but whatever this is in my front yard, followed him around a while trying to look for that. And so it changed the approach of what I was shooting. Now, this is a dumb subject. Who's going to go shoot a butterfly? But I'm showing you how you build up tension and resolution over a series of images. It can be done with, I mean, it has to be done right now with things around the house, right? So this is my cat, Judy, who's usually in the room. She's not right now. But following her around for a day, observing what she does. And so how do you get attention and resolution out of that? So that ends up being what I start to look for. And I took these from a sequential approach. Maybe you could find a way to do it in one image even. I think that's a little trickier. Maybe that's the next step. But I think of like a photographer like Dwayne Michaels, who worked entirely pretty much in photo sequences. And his work was very descriptive and dramatic. If we look at allegro non troppo, which is going to be faster tempos. So what do we look for in here? Well, I can do this in a single photograph. We have a koi pond, right? And so we have the tension and we have the darkness and we have the water that creates a sense of motion, a sense of tempo, a sense of speed. I've talked about tempo over the years with composition. So this was probably a little more natural for me to do, but maybe this ends up being a largo, dead flowers in the yard. It's a dumb shot, but this is what I'm going for. I'm going for pacing. I'm training my eye to learn things, right? That's the idea. For me too, I think I started to think of this in terms of a theme that could go into a much larger body of work. And I know what Ralph is thinking because Ralph works in books. Those are his projects. And so The Somnambulist was a collection of work he did at the time that somehow has this kind of conceptual way of surrealistically relating to each other. One thing for me is I have this obsession with these flying things, like butterflies. This was at the Botanical Gardens a while back. And so that's a theme that can come back. Now, I'm not totally satisfied with where I am right now on these, but I don't, maybe I have block does anything to do with that, but maybe it does. I don't know. And so this is what I'm exploring with. This is a bridge. You know, how do you explore tempo visually with this? What does that say? Also with this, I was trying to bring back the harmonic metaphor too, the tension resolution kind of thing that was going on. Obviously here, you're going to see high tempo because of the high pattern and the high contrast of the sun coming into this office building. Again, with the flying object with the butterfly. And anyway, so that's what I was working on with Ralph, and a lot of it is a little bit conceptual and a little bit bizarre and heady, but it's what I felt comfortable with. I'm going to end it with this too. You know, the next thing for me, because you heard me do it 3 times just now when I was sharing work I wasn't comfortable sharing. Ralph shared some things that he was kind of working on right now. He says, I'm nervous sharing this with you because I don't like to share stuff that's unfinished for me. He said, so I understand where you're coming from. Then he got all over me. He said, I don't ever want to hear you apologize for a photograph again. And of course, I just did it 3 times. But his whole point was, he said, Ralph has watched my channel on and off over the years. And he said, one thing that strikes me, I'm being very forthcoming with you guys. This is not something I'd ever talk about on the channel because it's very personal. But he says, you never share your own work. And I said, well, people have made that. He said, well, why don't you? And I said, well, it's never been about me. It's about other people. It's about my passion for photography. It's about, he goes, oh, come on. At some point, we're all wondering, you've got to share your own work. And I said, well, and I thought about it. And then the next call that we were on, I said, I thought about that. And I said, the reason I don't share my work is that, I'll be honest, I was scared shitless when I started doing these videos, and who's going to watch me? And I knew I had something to say. I knew I had a philosophy. I just didn't think anybody would be interested in seeing my own stuff. Plus, it saved me, and I'm going to be very honest with you, it saved me from having to deal with criticism of trolls saying your work blows. Let's be honest. And that's something we all deal with. And I realized that maybe that needs to be part of the show moving forward. And I can't turn that on over the course of 1 week or one video, but there's some things in the back of my mind I'm working through because I would like to, I'm at a point right now where the show just kind of needs something fresh to it anyway. It's really easy, particularly with like a year like this where, you know, I end up doing camera reviews and stuff like that too, because that's what's current right now. It gets you views. People discover the other videos through the camera reviews. They're not looking for the other videos, you know? So there's a number of reasons why I do those, but it's been so intense the last 2-3 years with this mirrorless craze that's going on. And it's a desperation with these companies. They're trying to figure ways to stay afloat. Nikon's getting murdered right now. I think they all are. I mean, they're putting all these cameras out during COVID-19. Who's buying these things? They're not cheap either, you know? And why do you need that? Like Ralph was saying to me, 50mm lens, man, shoot with what you got. It's always, I mean, you know, here's the thing. I've shot on David Brookover's camera. My photos did not look like David Brookover's. You know, there's no magic bullet. It doesn't work that way. And David, if he used my stuff, he'd wipe me. He'd take me to the cleaners in terms of landscapes. I mean, because that's his thing. And he has a touch and an eye for that. And that's where everything is. But Japan tells you otherwise with the stuff. But my point is, and I wanted to talk about this with the 100-year plague, is that COVID-19, a couple of things that kind of keep me sane about it is one, I am hesitant how I say this, but we were kind of due for something. I'm old enough to remember in the US anyway, with 2001, when the tech boom crashed and the stock market fell, and 9/11 and all that, and the economy just tanked after that. That was a rough time. That was the first year I started freelancing. I was insane to do it then. And it was really rough for me financially too. I remember like living on my credit card. I was using a credit card to buy food and stuff, and then I maxed it out. It got bad. And I remember getting out of that hole later one day and thinking, I never, ever want to be there again. Guess what? In 2008, subprime lending crisis in the US, the banks are lending money to people who can't pay it back, whatever. And so we have a crash there. And so that sent the economy down. That was a tough one because that took years to recover from. And I remember sitting through that thinking, geez, this is like, I mean, these are bad times when you're not prepared for them. And I remember a couple of years ago thinking, man, things have been going smooth financially with my career, with everything else. You know, everybody's happy, healthy. The world seems as okay as you can consider it, I guess. So it's a fact of life. Things happen. Now, 2001, 2008, and now 2020, they don't look alike at all. The 100-year plague, by the way, is a reference to saying we get a sickness that goes around. Like, this is freak, what's going on right now. This was unexpected. This is not normal. Two things you have to understand. One, we'll get through it. It may take a while. It may take a couple of years. You can get through things. And two, we'll have other things in the future to deal with. So that's a consistent, you know, we know something that the sun comes up, it goes down, and every once in a while, something like this happens. So how you react to that is very key. And so by choice, I had to go listen to some cheesy self-help motivational stuff from Tony Robbins because it helped, you know, and then studying with Ralph Gibson, and then trying to figure out that I can tell you this from a creative standpoint. Like, that's the time to like bear down and get creative. Cause like 2008, that was around the time that I did all that darkroom work in the summer. I didn't have money to distract me with things. You know, it was a lack of it. And so it's like buying cheap cameras, spending all your money on film, and just getting creative, just doing something nuts. these are the times to do those things, and just embrace it for what it is. Because I always look back and I'm like, well, what I don't want to do is we get beyond COVID-19, and then I realize that I spent however many months it was wallowing in it and being upset and depressed and angry. That's a waste of time. I'm not interested in that. And I hope that's good advice for somebody. I know everybody's a little bit different. There's more to it than that. I mean, there's other climates that are boiling points right now. And look, I understand all of it, but you ultimately don't have control over most of that stuff. You do have control about how you react to it. So all to come back to the advice that future Ted would give past Ted is do what you're doing and do every minute of it. You just be enthusiastic, be inspired, love everything, and do everything, because it all is going to come together and make you who you are in the end. And I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Ted. I mean, particularly like for very, very, very humane and very thoughtful insight, yeah, into your creative process, yeah. And also, I completely know sharing your work, you're literally dropping your pants. You know what I mean? You are
exactly
yourself. And
I am wearing pants, by the way, Holger.
Yeah, me too, by the way. Yeah.
I know.
But that takes a great amount of courage, I think, no matter on which level you are, really, even like the top guys and the beginners and everybody in between. Is ultimately sharing the same experience. Photography really has a therapeutic element to it as well, and I'm really glad to see that you are exploring this and that you're working on this, because ultimately it's a form of expression and
yes.
And a form of self-recognition. And it's really interesting to hear how you're working on this with Ralph. And just want to say that I think, according to the messages that a lot of people are leaving here, I think they wholeheartedly agree. Yeah? So
this was long, I know.
Very, very interested in seeing, in you allowing them this insight into your work. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between you and Ralph and how the element of music brought you together? When was the moment, you think, when the spark when the sparks were
I'll be very candid about this. So, and I love Ralph. Let me preface it by saying that he's a wonderful human being. Ralph looks incredible. He's in his 80s. And we had, actually, it's actually interesting too, because we had some talks about that, because he asked how old I was a few times. And the sad thing is when you look at some of the past masters, the Saul Leiters and the Herberts, or whoever it is. Let me use Saul as an example. Saul was doing work late in life when he became known for doing that early work. Didn't take care of himself that well, and he was not able to operate on the level that he once was. And you see that with a lot of photographers. So that's something worth sharing with you guys, because I think Ralph, that was a very, very candid point. Ralph's in great shape and he feels like he's still up to making good work. And he said, you need to be there one day too. So just keep that in mind. And a lot of that, I mean, I'd already started walking and I can actually run now, which I'm very impressed with. But you do need to take care of yourself. It is important, because he's right. You are going to get to be in your 50s and 60s. And if you live longer than that, if you treat your body like a woodshed, you're going to pay the consequence. You're not going to be able to perform with the creative mindset and the type of work, or physically you can't get around to do it. So there's that. But we got around to music. So I've followed Ralph for years. I remember the first time I saw his work was I found Ex Libris, which is a book, photos of books. It's library related. Beautiful work. And I found that in a used bookstore years ago, and that was my intro to Ralph Gibson. And so I, like all of my heroes, I start researching the bejesus out of him, and I found that he was a guitar player, and that really was interesting to me. And he did a series of performance pieces a few years back where he would improvise on the guitar with all the electronic looping stuff, and he would have these slides that would project behind him. So very 60s and very cool. I know he's friends with Andy Summers. They are buddies through the Leica connection. I knew that he is familiar with a lot of there's a record label out of Oslo called ECM that did a lot of these esoteric jazz records over the years. And he's kind of in that vein. And I used to be a huge ECM fan. So I knew that. And so when I met Ralph, the first time I was invited over to his studio in New York a few years ago, there's a video I did on this too. I asked him if I could film that day. And it was funny. He was a wild man. He'd go over there, work all over the floor because he's preparing for a show. Pulling up prints, pulling up this and that. What do you think? What do you think? I have these heady conversations. And then he'd disappear. And I'm sitting there looking at stuff. And Thierry, which is this guy who introduced us, he was there. And all of a sudden you hear the guitar and you go over there. He's over there like jam time. It's like music, photos, just like he does not let, well, of course he may have been entertaining us too, but there's no filter for, I need to do this right now, which I love, that should be part of creativity. I don't give myself permission to do that here because I feel like I have responsibilities or whatever I gotta do. But anyway, so we did that. And then I told Ralph that I had a music background. I told him then, and then when we started doing the lesson stuff recently, I told him that the first round. I said, by the way, the music thing and blah, blah, blah. Ralph, and I understand this because I do the same thing. A lot of people do. It's like when you've spoken publicly enough, and Ralph beats me in this regard completely. You have, it's guitar licks, for another musical analogy. He has some of the same things he does a lot. And so I noticed in the first lesson, because I've watched a lot of videos in Ralph Gibbs, I'm like, I've heard you say this 100 times, so I got to dig deeper, right? And so you have to get the most, and this could be studying with anybody, but to get the most out of them, I think it's really important to reflect on and come up with some questions where you can start digging deeper and you can pull that out of them. Don't expect them to just have that ready in a curriculum. So we started doing that and we hit the third lesson and he mentioned a musical term. And I said, oh yeah. And I don't remember what it was. And I said something to respond to. He goes, oh wait, you got musical, and then he remembered. So it was like, it took a little while. And so then so we started, he said, so are you familiar with, we started talking about what you and I were talking about earlier. There's a bigger connection between music and visual arts than most people realize. And that's, I don't know why, but it does seem like, for instance, that it's natural for you. We're talking about being a drummer earlier. Alexi had the music background. I have one. Ralph has one. It's just really interesting to see how that ties together. But Ralph, though, is a conceptual thinker. And for him to say, I got an idea, I'm gonna give you something really hard to do, but it's brilliant because like all of a sudden people, I say this in videos sometimes, but people get burnout sometimes. We all do. And you get caught up on not knowing what you want to shoot, right? So what do I want to do? Well, people, places, things, that's what it is. Those are nouns, right? And this is one of my guitar licks because I say it now all the time. But what you want to do is start thinking about shooting verbs. How can you go deeper than that? And this is one thing that I think was really hard for me with COVID-19. When you're stuck at home, I have seen this place for the last 5 years and I spend way too much time in here anyway. I don't want to look at it at all. And it's really hard for me to remember that the viewer has not seen the way the light comes in a window at a certain time or what, and I do stuff with botanicals. I'm a little tired of that, but there's things. And so I have to learn how to look at my surroundings that I'm sick of in a new way. It's really hard to do. I've seen a lot of people, this is the struggle of COVID-19. You're stuck at home, right? And you're trying to keep from going crazy from boredom. And I think too, we all want to create, we want to make things, right? So you have no choice. But how can you do that? And I think that's one thing that Ralph has been really instrumental with my work with. And by the way, this is the first time I've ever talked about this with anybody. Actually, when I told Katerina about it, that was the first time I ever told anybody. I told Ralph that this was a secret. And the reason it was is I'm not doing it for the show. I wanted to do something for me. And this was all part of like countering the depression I was kind of fighting off at the beginning of COVID. And by the way, I know everybody's dealt with this. I'm not trying to say that I'm off on my own. I'm the only one who's depressed. And I had to find, I know everybody is. I'm trying to share my experience because I hope I can inspire somebody else because I see a lot of angry friends these days and it bothers me. I need to call them and have the same talk, but not today because my throat's gone. But anyway, but that's what it is. And so I always say, try to, instead of thinking of your work in nouns, think in verbs. So I could be shooting a person. Well, that's neither here nor there. What are they doing? What is it I'm expressing or what is it I'm showing through this? And you look at the great photographers, that's how they work. Or I'm looking at a place. How is this? am I supposed to know where this is, or am I supposed to question where this is? So that could have an impact right there on how you shoot it. Maybe you're like, okay, well, if I shoot it at noon, it's going to be real obvious what this place is. But if I shoot it in the early morning, or if I shoot it late at night, it has a different character, and I could disguise that a little bit. So you start to kind of think through challenges that you could put in front of yourself. Now, are you always going to succeed? No, but it's like going to the gym. It's like creativity is the muscle, right? And my mother says this all the time, and I actually love it. My mom is an interior decorator, has done, she sews, she very creative family. But my mom always says, you know, the thing that when you, if you're not doing it, you're going to lose it, and you can get it back, but it's just going to take. It's like not going to the gym for 4 months, and then the day you go back to the gym, you are hurting because you've lost it all, right? You're going to have to build it back, but you're from square one. So it's something that you constantly have to be doing. I mean, as dumb as it sounds, one thing I try to do is grab a camera. And right now in the winter, the sun starts going down in a different place, and it's kind of low in the sky. And so all these windows in the front of my house kind of this house is at a diagonal, get interesting light. And I'm lit by it right now, right? So this time of day, it starts. Now I can't do this in the summer, but you got to be aware of those cycles. But I'll when I'm shutting down work at 5 or 6 or whatever, I grab a camera and I just try to find something. And it may be nothing. It may be a window. It may be a corner. It could be the way that catches my eye. I try not to do anything up here because it's just lenses everywhere. But you know what I mean? It's just trying to just keep that repetition alive. Yeah, and this works great if you have a full-time day job. You just got to remember to keep at it sometimes, you know?
It's particularly interesting because just before the talk, we had a quick chat about the relationship between music and photography. And, you know, maybe giving yourself the task, for example, to take some pictures that evoke the same emotions as a song that you like, yeah, or a piece Absolutely. That you like, yeah. Did you know, Ted, that apparently the ears are linked to a part of the brain that's associated with the instinct, which apparently is a really old part of the brain.
I did not know this.
So apparently that's one of the reasons why, for example, something like music can make you cry really easily. Whereas, for example, a pure photograph, or in general, apparently like your eyes are much more modern senses, and they're linked to the part of the brain that is associated with the intellect. Yeah, so we tend to just
interesting
through everything that we see, but not necessarily, we don't necessarily think through everything that we hear. And I think to kind of bridge those two things, for example, I personally find it very difficult, or there are very few images that can actually make me cry, whereas for a song that's much easier, I must confess. And to try to bridge these two parts, yeah, the instinctive and the emotional with the intellectual and the visual is a really interesting task and a really interesting theme, I think.
You know, I think you're right. That makes total sense, because the way that I respond to music that I like, it's a very different feeling than visual work. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's the intellectual versus the intuitive or the instinctive.
Exactly, I would like to talk to you about I would like to address a few questions to you. I know that we had a few of them accumulating here in the Q&A folder for quite a while. Guys, we haven't forgotten about you. And also just really quickly want to say that you got a lot of very positive feedback and from the listeners. And I think you have really touch a nerve here, I think, that is so important to touch here.
I'm sorry, I closed the chat, so I see them pop up. I am Mr. Attention Deficit Disorder, and if I see those, then I'll forget what I ramble enough as it is, so I have not looked at them.
I'm gonna forward the applaud to you, but just really want to say that I think that you have touched on a nerve that is so important to talk about. Also something like creative doubt is a really important part of the creative process, I think.
Yes.
Because that is also one of the driving forces, I think. Yeah, good. So I would like to now forward a few few questions to you. Also,
Sure.
everybody who's on board, feel free to ask to post any questions into the Q&A box. So we've got Newland asking. Sometimes I feel like only boring comment things get big on Instagram, because it's very trend-based. Maybe one person starts it off as something new, but everyone mimicking a style that's getting even bigger than the original. It feels a bit discouraging. Is that something that you speak on, that you can speak on, about the influence of social media and finding your own style?
Start by saying you should follow Newland on Instagram, because I do. She's got 2 accounts. She's a very good photographer. It's funny, I know a lot of these people because I've had shows where I've had people send in work before, and it's reminding me, seeing a lot of the names in here, that it's like, this is why I did it, because it's cool, because then you meet people with common interests around the world. But let's talk about Instagram. So yeah, so you have no control over what Instagram's going to do, and the problem with Instagram is that as it's grown, not only has the content that's on there become saturated, but it's let's be real about what Instagram is. It's a battle for people's attention, so you can make money on an ad platform. I personally, I think that if you do good work, and I know that Newland does, and you believe in it, you've got to determine what you want to get out of Instagram, I think. And I know that, like, everybody wants, because I'm the same way, you want some kind of organic growth. In other words, I'm not going to pay for ads or pay for placement or whatever. Having said that, though, and I hate to say this, but you know, I have to remind myself of this all the time too, but like when you get into art and when you get into any of the great photographers or whatever, we always think of them as being these huge names, these wonderful people, like, you know, like the celebrities or something. Graciela Iturbide, who is one of my heroes, nobody knows who she is. I mean, so it's just a limited audience. And so when you're putting things that have limited interest into a space where it's just, you're competing with, it used to be the joke was you're competing with cat videos, and you still are, but it's even weirder than that. There's all these bizarre trends that will come up that have nothing to do with what you're doing. And your audience, or, you know, who might follow you, they might have their own interests. It's just really hard to control any of that, I think. I don't know, Helga, if you have anything to say on this, but I think Instagram has just changed. I think we've hit the point of the iceberg with Instagram, where I think if you're a business on Instagram, you almost have to be paying for visibility. If you're trying to be an artist on Instagram, I think one thing I've considered doing with my work is, rather than putting up an image looking for likes, is just treat it more behind the scenes. Because like, I follow a lot of musicians that I'm into on Instagram, and that's how they use it, because it's a visual tool, and they're not going to put, like, I guess they could do music videos or something, but it's mostly behind the scenes. I've seen some musicians do some really creative things on there during COVID-19. What's cool about that is then you build a narrative. When you're just putting up images that are just, we were talking about context earlier, don't have an obvious context around them. Maybe they do, but it's just supposed to be a pretty picture or something you worked hard on, or concept, or part of a series or whatever. You're seeing it that way, but there's no narrative in that. Everybody else is seeing is, here's a pretty image out of context. It's something. Here's the other thing. They're just flicking by it, right? So I think that if you can build that narrative, and you can show somebody what you, look at what we're doing right here. We're having a long talk today. I don't care how many people are in here, but I know some people are getting something out of it. And that makes me feel better. I needed something like this, actually, because it hadn't been like that in a while. I mean, especially this time of year when you get into having a lot of work to do. So building that narrative is important. And I think that when I mentioned, why don't you show your own work, is what Ralph asked, because I was spending so much time building a narrative, I never narrated my own work into that. I kind of avoided it, actually. So there's that. But I just think it's gonna, I don't know how to answer that question. I know I'm rambling around. I hope that helps a little bit. It's just, I think you need to look at it differently at this point. Like, build your website, put your work there, and then you can keep it in context. You know?
It's true. I mean, also maybe social media could be seen as in relationship, for example, to also having a web page. Yeah, so you already said that I mean, for me, social media is another side of the same coin, which is like your web page, like the official presentation. Then social media can really give you like this insight into the creative process, and it can, you know, show the behind the scenes. So you've got two things: you've got the amazing product, and you've got the human element to it, and you can tell how it came into being. Yeah, and I think both of them together are a really strong combination. I'm going to move on. We've got Manuel asking, is there content you made for the museum still available on YouTube?
I haven't looked in a long time. I don't know. It may be. The one, there's only a few things that I'd even be proud of now. I mean, we did a lot of curator interviews, a lot of, and that was a weird time for me. And that's not work. I had a lot of people hovering over me on a lot of those projects, and they were way micromanaged, and so I don't care. I kept a lot of it. Now there are a couple projects that we did. One of them that I did like was when we did an exhibition with Jean-Paul Gaultier, which is, I mean, he's haute couture fashion, and that was a controversial exhibition because that's, a lot of people don't consider that to be art. I kind of do. It was a great exhibition of costumes and all kinds of things. That one was pretty cool because I got to do a video with Jean-Paul. And he's just a nut. I mean, he fires, but he's a pro, man. He came out, he did this thing. So we had a press day, and all the news would get to interview him, and they needed me to do a small video piece that we could use for a couple different things. And so I said, fine. Well, they put me last. I'm like, I work here. Good. So they put all the media first. Anyway, so I knew he was just going to be tired. So he came over, he says, what is this video? And I said, well, the video is going to be, because you're not going to be here through the exhibition, you're leaving today. I'm Jean-Paul. I'm sorry I can't be with you. Oh yeah, got it. He comes out, and like as soon as you say, okay, action, he's on, and he's hilarious. And and then he drops off the camera at the end, and there was a group of people watching us, and I just hear people applauding. I mean, it's amazing to see somebody like that who's so good at talking to the public. I think that video is probably still up. You'd have to go look. But anyway, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that. You know, it's also funny because when I've talked to artists too, and I'm over answering this question, but when I talk to artists too, a lot of times, Ralph and I mentioned this because he was friends with Robert Frank and worked for him at one point, and they stayed friends until Frank died. And he said that part of why Frank was a little curmudgeon-y was that, you know, everybody knows him for what? The Americans, right? Well, it came out in the 50s. Well, can you name any of the movies he's done since? You know, maybe one, maybe two. So that's what I mean when you're known for work that's that old. So I same thing for me. I don't identify myself with a lot of those projects that I did at the museum. So I don't know if they're up or not.
Okay, thank you so much. We've got an anonymous attendee asking, do you think emotion in a photograph is more powerful than a strong composition?
Sure. Yeah. And that's another thing too, is that again, you got to be of your time and you've got to understand things. Now we understand composition. That was something that was visually more trending when Henri Cartier-Bresson was doing it. Robert Frank comes out and he divorces from that. Like they're not even holding the camera straight sometimes. So that's actually a perfect, because both of those are historical and they've stood the test of time. If you look at William Eggleston, he gets controversial. People don't like that color work. I think Robert Frank, though, because he's making America in the 50s, he's showing that there's a dark side to it, and that anger and that emotion is part of that. Yeah, so I mean, it depends on your taste too. I mean, they're both important, but yeah, I think the emotion probably trumps it.
We've got Fatima asking, do you think Arnold Newman's piano portrait best represents your interest of both photography and music in one image? Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd say. I mean, I was the first time I saw that, my recollection on it, I was 10, and so I didn't really have. I mean, my experience with photography was the wall of images that I was looking at, and my experience with music was probably listening to Duran Duran or something ridiculously asinine on my Walkman, and that's what I did. I had a Styx tape. I thought that was really cool back then. I was 10. You know, give me a break. but I like Toto. Actually, back then I had a Walkman. It was just a radio. I'm really old. But yeah, but you know, it's interesting though. One thing that I find fascinating about that it really is a vivid. I mean, I just close my eyes and I can see their living room. I mean, everything is right there. The sounds, the smells, the whole thing. And I didn't know who that was. And I think it's just kind of interesting that it was so drawn into two things that became passions later in life. Maybe it formed it on some kind of subconscious level.
Yeah. But it's also really interesting that you're so that you have so vivid memories about this moment. For example, one assignment that we do at the school to help the students to define their own style is ask them to bring their 10 most memorable images of their lives. These can be from any part of their career. So very often these can be like early childhood memories or their formative years. So, but or maybe also something that people have seen yesterday. And then in an almost psychoanalytical process, we analyze those images for common themes, and use this really almost like as the trajectory for their future work. And
I like that. Yeah.
Really interesting, like what it does to the students on a creative level. Yeah, it's very, just in case if anyone's interested in that, or I do this myself really quite often. And it's really interesting to do this with someone external, ideally someone who has a visual education or visual training, who's able to extract those common themes from it. Yeah, but it's a very, very interesting journey, I must say. I'm going to go on. We've got someone.
Real quick though, when you say you do that yourself, is that a great exercise? I could see that being a really good exercise when you're a little bit stuck or a little bit burnt out, just to kind of revisit and.
Yeah.
You think it has that kind of effect? Or?
Yeah, I do this myself every half a year, and
cool.
So from those 10 images, maybe 7 or 8 images remain the same, and you have a certain percentage that is being replaced, because obviously, like your interest changes, you change, the world around you changes. Yeah. So
but you also have to study your own work, and I'm really bad about that. Like I've taken the picture, I've done a quick color correction, contrast, I'm on to something else. And I don't spend a lot of time analyzing my own stuff. Ralph got on me for that too.
But you
gotta look at, you gotta recrop, you gotta like analyze, But that's from a thematic approach. Like you're talking about like what is resonating with you and what stays. I love that. I think that's cool.
Yeah, it's true. But that's also why having those talks, getting in touch with other people is so incredibly important. Because back in the days, as a photographer, you went maybe to the dark room, you went to the studio, you met other photographers, and you start to talk about photography, you start to show your work. It was almost like part of it. Whereas nowadays in the digital world, it can happen so quickly that you just live in your own creative bubble, and that you don't have feedback, that you don't converse with other people. And that's the reason why forming this community, and you're such an important part of this, Ted, and that's the reason why I'm so happy to have you on this talk. That is so important, that people show their work, that they get feedback, that they see other people's work, that they give feedback on this as well. I'd like to move on to Zed Brierly. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce this properly. Comment. I know you've talked a bit about this, but what would you say to your 18-year-old self? So probably when you just started out, what would you say, Ted?
Well, I sort of ended with saying that, but I would. Every experience adds up, and do what you love, and realize too that you can control things. If you really are getting a bad sense of something, then it probably isn't the right thing to do. I don't think I've ever had too much of that where I was down a road that I just wasn't interested in, that I was wasting time with. I kind of follow my interest, but the thing is, it's like, it all ends up somewhere. And I think what I did not understand at 18 is that whether it's music or photography, it's all creative expression. And actually, I would even argue that now so much of it is all in one pot. I mean, like I've done my own music for my show. I produce video. I mean, we're at a point, one person couldn't have done a whole production when I was 18. You would have had to have a crew. It would have cost a fortune. You were still shooting film, and there's no digital video back then. So, you know, you just got to follow your passions and just enjoy everything. But make sure you're excited. It's when you're not excited that things slow down, you know.
Yeah, we've got
they don't matter, you know?
If someone came up to you with an interest in portrait photography, in what direction would you point them?
Well, again, you got to know the great portrait photographers. I'll tell you what I would say is stay off of Instagram and in any camera review website where you see the beautiful girl with the blurred out background shot wide open at f1.2 or whatever the expensive lens costs. Arnold Newman comes to mind because he was the master of environmental portraits. There are many others. He was a very conservative, mid-century kind of style to what he did. But like the Stravinsky portrait, I think is an example of that. How do you say something in a portrait? Because let's be honest, like you know, the babe with the blurry background's been done too much, and there's nothing of interest there. It's what it is. I mean, it doesn't say anything. Unless you're dating the babe and you know, then I guess it says something to the photographer. And that's actually, I mean, I'm glad I thought of that, because that is another pitfall that you can do. There are things that emotionally we get connected to in photographs because we know everything about the behind the scenes. It's our work, particularly if you have a shot of your mother that you love your mom, you know, you're gonna like, it's going to say something to you that may not mean anything to somebody else. So being able to step outside of that a little bit is, you know, I don't know. I think it's just important to be able to see things from a different angle. It's a really dumb pun, but yeah, you know what I mean? It's like, I think environmental portraits, I think is definitely something where you can take that another step. And what are you showing with the portrait? You're showing somebody who somebody is, or what they look like, or is it a gap ad? I mean, I don't know. And that's another thing, is like there's commercial expectations that follow visual trends that you're going, if you're a commercial photographer, you will be asked to follow. It's going to take a really strong argument to break out of a trend like that. So anyway, but I'm just saying, you know, do more work. I don't know who I saw Newland's comment. She says, OMG, personal attack. I hope I didn't attack somebody in here other than the camera review of the 1.2 lens.
Good, thank you so much. We're going to bring it to an end now. What a very exciting talk. I'm so glad we had this chat. Everybody else, thanks for staying with us. Really, it's been really quite a journey, I think. Just in case if someone joined us after I made my introduction at the beginning, you can see the recording of this video on our webpage, which is www.lip.co.uk, together with lots of other really interesting recordings by influential artists, as I said, agents, curators, video artists. We are covering the entire range. Have a look. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please sign up or consider to sign up to our newsletter. Then we're going to keep you updated, because we have some really interesting talks coming up in the following month. Thank you so much. And you need to sign up, because I've already promised, Holger, that when COVID's over, I'm coming to London. We're going to do this again live from the school when all is back to normal, and we're going to invite everybody here to, yes. I'm gonna high five you.
High five for sure. I tell you, the second I can travel, I can't wait.
Yeah.
It's time.
I must boast, we are in one of the coolest, our institute is located in one of the coolest spots in London. So awesome. Come over. We've got really fantastic venues here, and I'd love to have a pint with you as well. Yeah. No,
I absolutely consider it done. We get a good dark beer going, and it'll be good. It'll be all right. So okay. Thank you for having me. This was great.
Yeah. High five.
Thanks everybody for coming. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
We'll see y'all later. All right. Bye-bye.